What happens when the most powerful woman in the room realizes the man who just saved her billion-dollar empire is the same quiet farmer she almost didn't bother to speak to? Olivia Hayes built her fortune on reading people. She could spot a liar across a boardroom, dissect a contract in minutes, and outmaneuver men twice her age before her coffee went cold. But Cedar Hollow had a secret she never saw coming. And that secret wore muddy boots, drove a dented pickup, and came home every evening to tuck a 9-year-old girl into bed. If this story moves you, drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far it travels. The first frost came 3 days earlier than anyone expected. Mason Reed noticed it before sunrise, the way he noticed most things. Quietly, without announcement, while the rest of the world was still asleep. He was standing at the kitchen window with a mug of coffee that had gone lukewarm, watching the thin white crust spread across the grass like something had breathed on the field overnight and left it cold. The orchard looked different in that light. The apple trees had started dropping leaves the week before, and now those leaves sat frozen against the roots, dark and heavy and still. He set the mug down. "Dad!" He turned. Emma was standing at the bottom of the stairs in her pajamas, the ones with the little foxes on them that she'd had since second grade and absolutely refused to let him throw away. Her hair was going in 3 different directions, and she had a crease on her left cheek from her pillow. "It's 5:40, Mason said. "I know." She rubbed her eye with the back of her hand. "I heard you get up." "Go back to sleep." "I can't. I had a dream about the chickens." He looked at her for a second. "What kind of dream?" "The mean one got out again." He almost smiled. Almost. "Dolores is locked up. I checked last night." Emma padded into the kitchen in her socks and pulled herself up onto the counter stool, watching him the way she always did when she was half awake and not fully committed to conversation yet. She had her mother's eyes, that particular shade of brown that wasn't quite brown, wasn't quite gold, somewhere in between, like river water in August. Mason didn't let himself think about that most mornings. Some mornings he didn't have a choice. "There's frost," she said, looking out the window. "Yep. Is that bad for the apples?" "Most of them are already down. The late Fuji's might take a hit." He moved to the stove. "Eggs?" "Scrambled." "Obviously." He pulled the cast iron from the hook and set it on the burner. The kitchen smelled like old wood and coffee and the cedar log he'd burned in the fireplace the night before. It was a smell Mason associated with exactly one thing: this house. This specific version of his life, which was either a comfort or a trap, depending on the day. He'd stopped trying to figure out which. The farm sat on 42 acres at the edge of Cedar Hollow, Colorado, where the valley started to climb toward the San Juans and the road turned to gravel about a quarter-mile past the Kellerman property. It wasn't a beautiful piece of land in the way that magazines photographed. The main barn had been patched so many times it looked like it was held together by stubbornness. The fencing along the north edge was older than Mason, and he'd been meaning to replace the corner posts for 2 years. The house itself, a 2-story farmhouse built sometime in the 1940s, had seen better decades, but it was theirs, or more accurately, it was Emma's. Mason had made that decision quietly and privately 3 years ago. Whatever happened to him, the farm went to Emma. He'd had a local attorney, a real one, draw up the paperwork. He'd done it on a Tuesday afternoon and hadn't told a soul. That was the kind of man Mason Reed was. Things got decided, then they got done, and they didn't need to be discussed. The neighboring property had been in the Hayes family for 20 years. Old Walter Hayes, a man who had spent his career building a logistics company from a single leased warehouse in Denver into something worth several $100 million, had bought the land as a retreat, a place to come when the city felt like it was eating him alive. He'd never farmed it. Most of the acreage just sat there, managed by a caretaker who came twice a week and didn't talk much. Walter himself showed up 4 or 5 times a year, usually in a truck that cost more than Mason's entire equipment inventory. They'd wave across the fence line. Sometimes they'd lean against the posts and talk for 20 minutes about the weather, about the deer that kept getting into Mason's north plot, about nothing in particular. Walter was the kind of rich man who had figured out that being rich didn't make him better than anyone, which in Mason's experience was a rare thing. His daughter was a different matter. Mason had seen Olivia Hayes exactly twice before that October, Once at the Cedar Hollow gas station, where she'd been standing beside an Audi with a cracked phone screen, looking at it the way people look at things they're deciding whether to fix or replace. And once through the fence, about a year ago, when she'd been walking the Hayes property in city clothes that were clearly not built for the terrain, on her phone the entire time. He hadn't formed a strong opinion of her. She was the kind of person who moved through small towns like she was passing through, not passing time. He had no reason to think that would change. Emma's school bus came at 7:15. Mason walked her to the end of the gravel drive the same way he did every morning. Emma thought she was too old for this. She'd told him twice. He'd listened both times and continued doing it anyway. Aiden Brewer says his dad is getting a snowmobile, she said, scuffing her boot against the gravel. Good for Aiden Brewer's dad. He said we could probably borrow it. We're not borrowing Aiden Brewer's dad's snowmobile. Emma made a sound that was somewhere between a sigh and a word she'd decided not to use. Why not? Because we don't borrow things we don't need. What if we needed it? Then we'd buy one. Do we have enough money for a snowmobile? Mason looked down at her. You worry about the wrong things, kid. I'm not worried. I'm just asking. The bus came around the bend before she could push further. Mason watched her climb the steps, watched her find her seat toward the back. She always picked the same one, second from the rear on the left, and watched the bus disappear down the road. Then he turned around and went back to work. He was replacing a section of fence along the property line at 10:30 when he heard the car. It was a rental. He could tell by the slightly too clean look of it, the Virginia plates, and the way the driver navigated the gravel like they weren't completely sure what gravel was for. It pulled up along the Hayes property and sat there for a moment before the door opened. Olivia Hayes was taller than he remembered. She was wearing dark jeans, clean boots that were trying to look practical without actually being practical, and a jacket that probably cost more than his hay baler. Her hair was pulled back, and she had sunglasses pushed up on her head even though the sky was overcast. She walked toward the fence line with the specific energy of someone who had a purpose and expected the world to accommodate it. Mason kept working. He had 3 posts to reset, and he wasn't going to stop because someone had parked nearby. Excuse me. He drove a staple into the post and looked up. She was standing at the fence, maybe 15 feet away. Up close, she looked like she hadn't slept particularly well. There were shadows under her eyes that her posture was trying to argue against. She held a manila folder against her side like it was a prop she'd brought to establish authority. Mason Reed, she said. That's right. I'm Olivia Hayes. Walter Hayes is my father. I know who you are. He went back to the post. Is Walter okay? A brief pause. She hadn't expected that to be his first question. He's fine. He's in Denver. I'm here because... She stopped, started again. I need to talk to you about a property matter. What kind of property matter? There's an easement dispute. My company holds some land interests that overlap with access routes on your northern boundary. And there's a question about whether the existing easement agreement from 2009 is still valid, given certain transfers that happened in 2017. Mason put down the fencing pliers, turned to look at her fully for the first time. The Hayes family sold the mineral rights on the north parcel to Ridgeline Resources in 2017, he said. But the surface easement wasn't part of that transaction. It stayed with the land. Whoever told you the 2009 agreement was in question either didn't read the transfer documents carefully or was hoping you hadn't. Olivia stared at him. It was a very specific kind of stare, the kind that happened when someone's expectations collided with reality, and the collision was loud. How do you know about the 2017 transfer? She said. I live next door. He picked up the pliers again. I pay attention. The mineral rights transfer was... That's not public information. The deed is filed at the county recorder's office in Montrose. It's been public since November 2017. He glanced at her. About 120 pages. There's a section on page 47 that specifically exempts surface easements from the transaction scope. I'd suggest reading it before you have any more conversations with whoever told you there was a dispute. Silence. A long one. Can I... She stopped. Could I see your copy of the deed? Mason looked at her for a moment, then he nodded toward the house. I'll be done with this post in about 20 minutes. Coffee's on. She didn't sit right away. She stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the space the way people do when they're not sure if they're intruding. The kitchen was functional in a way that had nothing to do with aesthetics. Cast iron hooks, worn counters, a farm table with mismatched chairs, a magnetic whiteboard on the refrigerator covered in Emma's multiplication practice, and a grocery list that said eggs, more, chicken feed, duct tape. Real duct tape, not the blue stuff. Sit wherever, Mason said, pouring the coffee. She sat at the end of the table, straight-backed, folder in front of her, still in business mode, even in a farmhouse kitchen. He set a mug down in front of her and pulled a box file from the shelf beside the back door. He kept hard copies of everything related to the property: deeds, surveys, easement agreements, tax records. The box was organized in a way that would have surprised anyone who saw the barn. He found the transfer document and set it on the table, open to page 47. She read it. He drank his coffee and looked out the window. The frost was melting now, the grass going from white to gray-green as the sun worked its way through the clouds. This is, she trailed off, exempt surface easements, section 4.2, subsection C. He didn't say I told you because it didn't need to be said. My legal team told me this was ambiguous. Your legal team was wrong. She looked up at him. Or they had another reason for telling me it was ambiguous. Something shifted in her voice when she said that. The business mode quality dropped out, just for a second, and underneath it there was something that sounded like genuine uncertainty. Like she was thinking out loud and hadn't quite decided whether she trusted him enough to do that. Mason sat down across from her. How long have you been dealing with this? He said. She blinked. The easement? No, whatever's actually going on. Another silence. This one was different from the last one. I don't know what you mean, she said, but she didn't sound certain. You drove from... He looked at the folder. Colorado rental car, Virginia plates. Wherever you flew in from, to a farm in the mountains, to ask about an easement that your attorneys could have handled. That's not how people like you handle easement questions. People like me. People who run large companies. You have attorneys, you have staff. You flew here yourself. He looked at her steadily. So there's something else. She was quiet for a long moment. She turned the coffee mug in her hands without drinking from it, looking down at it like she was running calculations. There's a situation at the company, she said finally. I'm trying to understand who I can trust. And you thought a fence-line farmer was a safe bet. I thought... She stopped. I thought starting with something small and verifiable was smart. He respected that, actually, the logic of it. And now that you've verified it? She looked at him directly. The uncertainty was still there, but something else was with it now. Consideration. I don't know yet, she said. She stayed for 2 hours. It wasn't planned. He could tell she hadn't planned it. She'd come expecting a 15-minute conversation about easements, maybe a copy of a document, and a quick exit back to whatever world she actually lived in. Instead, she stayed because one question led to another, and Mason kept answering them in ways that made her ask the next one. It wasn't anything dramatic. He didn't offer anything. He just answered what she asked. But the answers were specific in a way she clearly hadn't expected, not vague farmer wisdom, not hunches, but actual knowledge, details, dates, structural logic that she could check. At some point, she opened the folder she'd been carrying and showed him something. He looked at it without touching it, which she seemed to find notable. You can pick it up, she said. I can see it from here. He could too. The document, a summary of proposed acquisition terms, had 3 problems visible from 3 feet away, and he named all 3 in sequence before she'd finished reading him the header. She stared at him again. This time it lasted longer. Who are you? She said. The question was direct, not accusatory, not joking, genuine. He stood and refilled his coffee. A farmer. No, she said. You're not. He didn't answer that. He looked out the window at the frost-softened field, at the orchard where the apple trees stood bare and angular against the gray sky. He thought about Emma, about what time the bus would come back, about the fence posts he hadn't finished. I used to be something else, he said finally. I'm not anymore. She waited. He didn't give her anything more. She was smart enough to recognize when a door was closed. She left at noon, stood at the kitchen door for a moment before she went out, the folder under her arm. She'd put her sunglasses back on, even though it was still overcast. Thank you, she said. And she meant it. He could hear the difference between politeness and actual gratitude. For the coffee and the rest. Drive safe on the gravel, he said. First 10 feet after the driveway is soft. She nodded, started to leave, stopped. The thing I showed you, she said, the acquisition document, the 3 problems you identified. I didn't see anything, he said. She looked at him for a second. Something moved behind her expression. Right, she said. You didn't. She left. He stood at the window and watched the rental car navigate the gravel, careful in the soft sections, and disappear around the curve. Then he went back to the fence. Emma came off the bus at 3:40 with a paper turkey she'd made in art class and the information that apparently Marcus Delgado had put a rubber worm in Claire Hensley's lunch, and there had been significant crying and a note home to parents. Did Claire deserve it? Mason asked. Emma thought about it with more seriousness than the question probably warranted. No, but she did take his colored pencils without asking last week. Still not a rubber worm offense. No, Emma agreed. Probably not. She taped the paper turkey to the refrigerator beside the grocery list and climbed up on the counter stool to do her homework. Mason started dinner. Just soup, he had a pot of bone broth that needed using, and the cold weather made sense of it. Emma worked in silence for 20 minutes, which was longer than usual. Then she said without looking up from her worksheet, "Was someone here today?" He glanced at her. "Why?" "There's a second coffee mug." He looked at the drying rack. She was right. He'd washed both mugs, but they were both there. "Neighbor's daughter," he said. "Came by about a property thing." "The rich one?" "Walter's daughter, yeah." Emma processed this. "Was she nice?" "She was professional." "That's not the same thing." "No," Mason admitted, "it's not." Emma went back to her worksheet. He stirred the soup, the kitchen filled up with warmth and the smell of herbs and something that felt, if he was honest, a lot like ordinary life. He held on to that. He was good at holding on to ordinary things. He'd learned that the hard way, learned it in the specific way you only learn things when you've had them taken away. He didn't think about Olivia Hayes anymore that evening. He tried, anyway. Bam. 3 days passed. He fixed the fence. He drove into Cedar Hollow for chicken feed and duct tape. He helped Emma with a science project about water cycles, which involved a plastic bag taped to a window and more condensation than Emma had anticipated, and a small flood on the sill that they mopped up together at 10:30 on a Wednesday night, laughing in a way that neither of them planned. He did not hear from Olivia Hayes. He hadn't expected to. On the 4th day, he was in the barn replacing a damaged wheel bearing on the tractor when his phone buzzed. He didn't recognize the number. It was a 703 area code, Northern Virginia. He stared at it for a second. Then he answered. "Reed," she said without greeting, like she was already in the middle of something. "I need to ask you something." He set down the wrench. "Go ahead." "The 3 problems you identified in the acquisition document." She paused. Were they problems because the deal was structured badly or because someone wanted it to fail? He was quiet for a moment, thinking. "Both can be true," he said. "Bad structuring gives someone else the option to fail it on purpose." The pause on her end was significant. "That's what I thought." "What are you going to do about it?" "I don't know yet." She sounded like she was standing somewhere large and open. There was a slight echo, a parking garage maybe, or an empty office building. "I need to understand who's driving the bad structuring." "Someone on your board?" Another pause, longer this time. "What makes you say that?" "Because if it was your legal team, you'd have replaced them already. You're still asking questions, which means the problem is somewhere you can't easily reach." He looked at the barn wall. Old wood, gray light through the gaps. Board members are harder. She didn't say anything for a long moment. "You're very strange," she said. You know that? I've heard that. I need. She stopped. I'm going to be back in Cedar Hollow at the end of the week. My father asked me to come. Can I. Is it all right if I stop by? He thought about Emma, about the rhythm they'd built, about the way his life worked best when it stayed within its own borders. Friday afternoon is fine, he said. After 4. Thank you. He hung up and sat in the quiet barn for a minute before he picked up the wrench again. The wheel bearing wasn't going to fix itself. She showed up Friday at 4:15. This time she'd dressed more practically. Real jeans, a flannel-lined vest, actual hiking boots that had been broken in. The Audi was back, but she'd left it at the Hayes property and walked through the field to the fence line. That was a different kind of choice, and he noticed it without commenting on it. Emma was inside doing homework. Mason was splitting wood in the side yard when Olivia came up the path. You walked, he said. It seemed right. She looked at the woodpile. Can I help? Do you know how to split wood? No. Then probably not. She sat on the low stone wall near the yard and watched him work. He wasn't self-conscious about it. He'd learned that being watched doing manual work was only uncomfortable if you had something to prove. He had nothing to prove. My CFO's name is Victor Langford, she said after a few minutes. He's been with the company for 8 years. My father hired him. He's extremely good at his job. Mason split a log without answering. He proposed an acquisition 6 months ago, warehousing company in the Pacific Northwest. Clean balance sheet, good market position, reasonable valuation. She paused. My father was enthusiastic about it. The board voted to move forward with due diligence. And then things started to not add up. What kind of things? The due diligence reports came back cleaner than they should have been. I've seen enough acquisitions to know that clean reports on an aging infrastructure company are almost always wrong. Not because people are lying necessarily, but because people miss things. Nobody misses this many things. She was quiet for a second. And then there was the payment structure. What about it? There's a deferred compensation clause. $30 million split between 6 people, contingent on the acquisition closing. 3 of those people are on my board. She said it flat, without inflection. Like she'd said it out loud before and was checking whether it still sounded as bad the second time. It did. The other 3 are officers at the acquisition target. Mason stopped splitting. He set the axe head on the block and looked at her. That's not an acquisition, he said. That's a transfer. I know. You've got people on your board who stand to receive $10 million each if this deal closes. That's not a conflict of interest. That's a conspiracy. I know. Her voice was level, controlled, but beneath it, and he was listening for it, there was something that wasn't either of those things. I have the documents. I found them in a data room that Langford thought I didn't have access to. I wasn't supposed to find them. I think... She stopped. I think if I bring this forward without being very, very careful, I'm going to lose. How? Because 2 of the 3 board members have been on this board for 15 years. They have relationships with institutional shareholders I don't have. If they control the narrative, they can frame this as a founder's daughter overreaching, trying to undermine a deal that's good for the company because she's emotionally attached to her father's legacy. She said it like she'd heard it before. Maybe she had. And Victor Langford has been very careful. The deferred compensation isn't in the main acquisition documents. It's buried in a subsidiary agreement that most people would never find. But you found it. I found it. She met his eyes. Because someone told me where to look. Mason said nothing. She held his gaze for a moment. That guidance came through a specific channel. A person I trust. And when I asked that person where they got the information, they said someone had pointed them toward it. And when I asked who, she stopped. What did they say? They gave me a description. She paused. And then they told me the person had mentioned Cedar Hollow. The woodyard was very quiet. Somewhere behind the house, Dolores the chicken made a sound of deep personal dissatisfaction. There are a lot of people in Cedar Hollow, Mason said. There are about 840, Olivia said. I looked it up. He said nothing. She didn't push. She just sat on the stone wall and looked at him, and he looked back at her, and the October air sat between them, cold and clear. "I'm not asking you to explain anything," she said finally. "I'm asking you if you can help me build a case that won't fall apart." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "What's your timeline?" Something shifted in her expression. Not relief. Not yet. But the particular quality of someone who has been holding very still and realizes they might be allowed to move. 3 weeks, she said. The board vote on the acquisition is scheduled for November 14th. He picked up the axe, split another log. The sound cracked out across the yard and into the cold air. "You need an independent forensic accountant," he said. "Not someone who's done work for your company before. Someone completely outside the existing relationships. They'll need access to the subsidiary agreement and the due diligence files, the full versions, not the summaries. You also need the minutes from every board meeting in the past 18 months. Not the official minutes, the actual notes." She was writing something on her phone, not pretending to remember, actually writing it down. He appreciated that. "The actual notes?" she said. "How would I get those?" "Your board members' executive assistants take notes. The official minutes are edited. The originals exist somewhere. A personal drive, a filing system. You need someone on the inside who still has access and wants to do the right thing." "That's a big ask." "Yes." He looked at her. "Do you have anyone like that?" She thought for a second. "Maybe one person." "Then start there." He split another log. "And get a securities attorney. One who knows Delaware corporate law specifically. Not a generalist." "I have a securities firm I use. Not them." He shook his head. "You need someone Victor Langford doesn't know you know. His intelligence about your resources is part of how he's been staying ahead of you. New attorney, paid directly by you personally, not through company accounts." She'd stopped writing. She was staring at him. "You're telling me he's been monitoring my corporate legal spend. I'm telling you it's worth assuming he has." She sat back, looked at him for a long moment. "Mason." "Yeah." "Who are you?" He set the axe down, looked at the wood pile. It was a good-sized pile now. Enough to last a couple of weeks if the cold stayed like this. "A farmer," he said, "who used to know a different kind of field." She waited. He picked up an armload of wood and carried it toward the house. "You should stay for dinner," he called back over his shoulder. "Emma makes decent garlic bread when she's in the mood." There was a beat of silence. "Okay," Olivia said, like it surprised her, like she hadn't realized how hungry she was until he said it. Emma decided Olivia was acceptable. This was a high bar. Emma had a highly developed sense of whether adults were being genuine or performing at her, and she had no patience for the second thing. Mason watched her evaluate Olivia across the dinner table with the same quiet thoroughness that she evaluated everything. The paper turkey still taped to the refrigerator, the homework on the counter, the way Dolores had been complaining all afternoon. "Do you have chickens?" Emma asked. "No," Olivia said. I live in an apartment in Virginia." "Doesn't that feel small?" "It's actually pretty large." "But it's still inside." Emma seemed to find this troubling. "All the time?" "Pretty much." "Don't you get tired of being inside?" "Emma," Mason said, "I'm just asking." "Sometimes," Olivia said honestly, "especially lately." Emma looked at her for a second, then nodded as if that was the right answer. She tore a piece of garlic bread. She had in fact made the garlic bread with a level of butter that Mason had decided not to comment on, and handed it across to Olivia without being asked. Olivia took it. "What grade are you in?" she asked. "Fourth?" "What's your best subject?" Emma thought about it. "Science, and also arguing." Olivia's mouth turned up at the corner. It was the first time Mason had seen anything close to a real smile from her, and it changed her face in a way that was unexpected, less polished, more human. "Those are good skills," Olivia said. "My dad thinks so, usually." "Only usually?" Mason said. "You told me I was argumentative last Thursday." "You were arguing about the definition of the word argumentative, Bob. That's different." Emma pointed at him as if to say, "See?" and looked at Olivia, who was now apparently laughing. It was a quiet laugh. half surprised, like she'd forgotten that laughing was an option. Mason looked at his daughter. Emma was watching Olivia with that particular expression she got when she was recalibrating her opinion of something, like she had expected to find a closed door and found a window instead. He ate his soup. He thought about November 14th. He thought about what it would cost him to do what she was asking and what it would cost him not to. He'd walked away from all of it once, burned it behind him like a field you don't want to look at again. And now here it was, not dressed up in a suit this time, but wearing muddy boots and standing at his fence line, asking for something he still, despite everything, knew how to give. The soup was good. The garlic bread was too buttery. Emma told a story about the rubber worm that got better in the retelling, and Mason Reed sat at his kitchen table and felt the specific, uncomfortable weight of being needed in a way he'd promised himself he would never be needed again. He wasn't sure yet what he was going to do about that. Olivia left Cedar Hollow on Saturday morning. Mason watched the Audi disappear down the gravel road from the kitchen window, the same window where he'd stood 4 days earlier watching frost settle across the field. Emma was still asleep. The house was quiet in the way it got on weekend mornings before the day had any shape to it. Just wood sounds, and the furnace cycling on, and Dolores registering some grievance from the direction of the coop. He poured coffee and stood there for a while, not thinking about anything in particular. That was what he told himself. In practice, his mind was doing what it always did when a problem sat down in front of it, turning it over, examining the edges, looking for the load-bearing points. He'd spent years trying to make that stop. He'd gotten better at it, the way you get better at most things you practice consistently, but better was not the same as done. Victor Langford, deferred compensation buried in subsidiary agreements, 3 board members with 15-year institutional relationships, and $30 million of personal motivation to close a deal that wasn't what it appeared to be. A due diligence process so clean it could only be the product of either incompetence or deliberate management, and Victor Langford, by any measure, was not incompetent. Mason drank his coffee. The problem with the kind of thing Olivia was dealing with, and this was something he knew from experience, the kind of experience he didn't talk about, was that the people who constructed these arrangements were always counting on the cleanup being messier than the crime. They were counting on the target being unwilling to burn the house down to prove the fire was set on purpose. Most people weren't willing. Most people chose the settlement, the managed exit, the quiet resolution that let everyone save face and made the thing go away. The question was whether Olivia Hayes was most people. He'd spent 2 evenings with her, and he still wasn't entirely sure. She was sharp. That was evident from the first conversation, from the way she absorbed information and cross-referenced it against what she already knew without having to be told to. She had the instincts. Whether she had the stomach for what came after the instincts was a different question. He rinsed his mug, went out to feed the chickens. Dolores eyed him with her usual combination of suspicion and entitlement, and he gave her a slightly smaller portion than the others, which he knew was petty and did anyway. He had 3 weeks. He hadn't agreed to help her. Not in so many words. He'd given her a list of things she should do, which was different from agreeing to be involved. He'd kept that line clear, or tried to. But the list had been very specific, and specific lists implied ongoing knowledge. And ongoing knowledge implied ongoing contact, and that was a sequence of events he needed to think carefully about. The problem, when he really got down to it, was not Olivia Hayes or Victor Langford or the board or any of it. The problem was what it always was. Once he started, he wouldn't be able to stop at the right moment. He never had been. That was the thing he'd learned about himself in the years before Cedar Hollow. That his judgment about when to engage was good, and his judgment about when to disengage was not. He stayed too long. He pushed past the point where the pushing was clean. He told himself that version of himself was gone. Standing in the chicken yard on a cold October morning, watching Dolores stage a one-bird protest over feed allocation, he was not entirely confident that was true. His phone buzzed at 11:30. He was in the barn by then, working on the tractor again. It was a text from a number he didn't recognize. The area code was 312. Chicago. The message was 6 words. Heard you're in Cedar Hollow. He stared at it for a long time, then he typed back, "You heard wrong," and set the phone face down on the workbench. It didn't buzz again. He hadn't expected it to. Some things from before he'd managed to leave all the way behind. Others had a way of not quite believing him. Emma appeared in the barn doorway at noon with a cheese sandwich and the information that she'd finished her homework, which he confirmed was a lie when he checked it after lunch, and found 2 incomplete problems and a reading response that was 4 sentences shorter than the assignment required. They negotiated. He used that word, though Emma's side of the negotiation was mostly theatrical outrage, and she finished it by 2 o'clock, at which point she declared herself free and spent the rest of the afternoon building something in the backyard with fence stakes and twine that she described as a maze for the chickens, and that Dolores refused to engage with on principle. It was a good afternoon, the kind that felt uncomplicated from the outside. Mason spent most of it watching Emma from the porch, drinking coffee that went cold, and working through a problem he hadn't agreed to work through. By Sunday evening, he'd decided what he was going to do. He wasn't entirely at peace with the decision. He'd stopped expecting to be at peace with decisions a long time ago. Peace was for people whose choices didn't have weight to them, and his choices, historically, had always been heavy. You made them anyway. That was the thing. You just made them and carried what they cost. He picked up his phone and called the 703 number. She answered on the second ring. Background sound. A hotel room, maybe. A television someone had muted. "I need to see the full subsidiary agreement," he said, "and the due diligence reports. The originals, not the summaries. Can you get them to me securely?" A pause. Not a long one. "Yes. Not by email, not through any account associated with you or the company. I have a personal attorney. He can use a secure transfer." "That works." He leaned against the porch railing. The sky was doing something complicated in the west, layers of cloud going pink and gray at the same time. "And the board meeting minutes. You said you might have someone on the inside." "Her name is Diane Cho. She's been with the company for 11 years. She was my mother's personal assistant before my mother died, and then she became the board secretary." A pause. "She doesn't like Victor. She's never said that out loud, but I know." "Have you talked to her directly?" "Not yet." "Don't do it by phone or company email. In person, somewhere outside the office." He watched a cloud move across the edge of the mountains. "And Olivia?" "Yeah." "Be careful about your assumptions. The person you think doesn't like Victor might still be afraid of what happens to them if they help you." "I know." "I mean genuinely afraid, not abstract career risk afraid. The people Langford has aligned with, if this goes the way it looks, they're not going to treat a whistleblower gently." Another pause. When she spoke, her voice was quieter. "Do you know something specific about that? About Langford specifically?" He'd been expecting that question. He'd been deciding how to answer it for the past 48 hours. "Not specific," he said. "Pattern recognition. 8 years is a long time to build something like this. That kind of patience comes from a particular kind of person, and that kind of person doesn't react gracefully when the structure is threatened." "You sound like you've seen this before." "Go see Diane Cho," he said. "Let me know what she says." He hung up before she could push further. It wasn't that he was hiding something, or not exactly. It was that some answers created more problems than they solved, and right now Olivia didn't need more problems. She needed to move. The sky went dark. He went inside. Emma was asleep by 9, which was 30 minutes past her actual bedtime and 20 minutes before the bedtime she'd proposed during negotiations. He sat at the kitchen table after she went up, the house settled and quiet around him, and opened the box file. He wasn't sure what he was looking for. He already knew the property records backward. He pulled the survey maps, the old easement agreements, the original deed from when the farm transferred to him. Not because they were relevant to Olivia's situation, just because looking at them helped him think. The farm was solid, the ownership was clean. Whatever happened in the next 3 weeks, this would still be here. He told himself that mattered. He was mostly convinced. The secure file transfer arrived Tuesday morning through a link sent by a lawyer named Carl Whitman, whose brief message said only that he was acting on behalf of a client and that the files were encrypted and would auto-delete from the server in 72 hours. Mason downloaded them to a laptop he'd bought secondhand 3 years ago and never connected to the internet until now, a habit he'd developed in a previous life and maintained the way you maintained old reflexes, not quite knowing if they'd ever be useful again. He opened the subsidiary agreement first. It was 112 pages, formatted in the way that documents were formatted when the goal was to make the important parts hard to find. Dense paragraphs, cross-references that sent you 20 pages in either direction, definitions buried in appendices. Mason had spent years of his life reading documents like this. He went through it at the kitchen table with a legal pad, the lamp on, Emma's paper turkey visible at the edge of his peripheral vision. The deferred compensation structure Olivia had described was on page 88. 3 board members, Lawrence Pratt, Susan Chung, and David Holt, each listed as beneficiaries of a transaction completion bonus to be paid from a holding company called Strathmore Advisory Group, LLC. $30 million total, as she'd said. What she hadn't mentioned, what she might not have seen or might not have known how to read, was the additional clause on page 91. Strathmore Advisory Group, LLC was not a neutral third party. It was, according to the registered agent filing referenced in the footnote of page 91, majority controlled by an entity called Vantage Holdings, incorporated in Delaware, with a registered address that matched, when Mason cross-referenced it with a public database on his phone, the home address of one of the Pacific Northwest Warehousing Company's principal officers. The structure had a second layer. It wasn't just that 3 board members were being paid to close a deal. They were being paid by a company that was connected to the acquisition target itself, which meant the warehousing company was, in effect, paying Hayes Logistics board members to approve its own purchase. The corruption wasn't just about the deferred compensation. It was about who was controlling the compensation and what they expected in return, which made the valuation question a great deal more interesting. He turned to the due diligence reports. They were, as Olivia had said, suspiciously clean, but clean in a specific way. Not the absence of problems, but the presence of carefully worded reassurances that didn't quite answer the questions they appeared to be answering. The infrastructure assessment said the warehousing facilities were in compliance with applicable regulatory standards. It didn't say they were in good condition. The financial review said the acquisition target's revenue was consistent with industry benchmarks. It didn't say the revenue was real. The legal review noted there were no material pending litigation matters of which the company is aware. That language, of which the company is aware, was a specific kind of escape hatch. It meant nothing about litigation that existed but hadn't been disclosed. He sat back. He looked at the paper turkey. Then he picked up his legal pad and started writing. He worked for 4 hours, stopping twice to refill the coffee and once to check that Emma was still asleep. By the time he was done, he had 7 pages of handwritten notes and a structure in his head that was clear and unpleasant, and as far as he could tell, airtight. The acquisition wasn't just a bad deal, it was a mechanism. The warehousing company, he'd need to confirm this through an independent source, but the outline was already visible in the documents themselves, was likely carrying undisclosed liabilities. Structural problems with the facilities, possibly. Regulatory exposure, maybe. Revenue that looked solid on paper because the paper had been carefully selected. Someone on the seller's side knew the company was worth considerably less than its asking price, and they had decided that the most efficient way to get full price anyway was to ensure that the people approving the purchase had a personal financial incentive to stop asking hard questions. Victor Langford had either constructed this or been brought in to manage it. Either way, he was at the center. And Strathmore Advisory Group was the connection between the corruption and the cash. Mason closed the laptop, stacked his notes, sat at the kitchen table in the quiet house, and thought about what he was doing and what it meant. He was doing it, clearly. The notes were 7 pages and the outline was clear, and he'd stayed up until 2 in the morning because he was already inside the problem, and the problem had structure, and structure was the thing he had never been able to walk away from. The cost was harder to calculate. It wasn't about exposure. He'd thought through that carefully. He was not a party to anything. He owned no interest in the outcome. If someone wanted to know how a farmer in Colorado had identified a conspiracy in a corporate acquisition, the answer was going to be unsatisfying and boring. He'd read the documents, he'd followed the footnotes, he'd done the arithmetic. That was legal. That was, in fact, exactly what any competent person should have done. The cost was different from that. The cost was what he'd learned the last time he'd been inside something like this, and thought he was only advising. You started advising, and then the situation needed more than advice, and you gave more, and then the situation needed more still. And somewhere in that sequence, you stopped being a person who was helping and started being a person who was involved. And being involved changed what you were to people. And what you were to people changed what you were to yourself. He'd spent 3 years building a version of himself that didn't belong to anyone else's problems. He wasn't sure he was ready to let go of that. But the 7 pages of notes were real. And November 14th was real. And Victor Langford was real. And somewhere in a hotel room or an apartment or wherever Olivia Hayes was right now, a woman was trying to figure out whether she had enough to survive this. And he already knew the answer was not yet. And he already knew what she was missing, and he already knew how to find it. He went to bed at 2:15 and slept badly, and woke up at 5 with the frost on the grass again, and a decision already fully formed, the way decisions sometimes arrived. Not reached, but found, like they'd been waiting. He called Olivia at 7:30. "Strathmore Advisory Group," he said, when she picked up. A pause. "I saw it. Did you follow the registered agent to Vantage Holdings?" No, I didn't." Vantage Holdings traces back to one of the principals at the acquisition target. The deferred compensation isn't coming from a neutral third party. Your board members are being paid directly by the company they're supposed to be independently evaluating. Silence on the line. Not the thinking kind. The absorbing something that changes the shape of everything kind. She stopped. "That's securities fraud. If there are any shares publicly held, yes, possibly criminal, not just civil. Our company is private. Your company is, but some of your pension fund investors have positions that get reported. And Langford and the 3 board members may have had communications around those reporting periods that they would not want examined." He let that sit for a second. "Your securities attorney, have you found one?" "I have a meeting on Thursday." "Good. Tell them you need to understand the potential exposure to ERISA violations as well. The pension fund angle may be the cleanest avenue for a regulatory referral." "A regulatory referral," she said. "You mean reporting this to the SEC or the Department of Labor, whichever jurisdiction applies?" "Both, possibly." Another silence. He could hear her processing the shift in scale. What had started as a board dispute was becoming something considerably larger and more irreversible. "If I do that," she said slowly, "this doesn't stay internal." "No. This becomes public. It becomes criminal. It becomes—" She stopped. "Victor has been with this company for 8 years. He knows every relationship we have. If this goes public before I've secured the board structure, he could use those relationships to control the story. Which is why you need to secure the board structure first. I need a majority without the 3 compromised members. That's not automatic. There are 7 board members total. 3 are compromised. That leaves 4, including me. 4 votes is a majority of 7. Only if all 4 are committed, and one of the remaining 4 is my father." She paused. "He hired Victor. He trusts him. He has trusted him for 8 years. Telling him that trust was misplaced." She went quiet for a moment. "That's not a business conversation. That's a different thing." Mason didn't say anything. He was standing in the orchard with the phone, the bare apple trees around him, the frost still in the shadows. He'd walked out there without really thinking about it. It was where he went when he needed to think straight, had been since the first year on the farm. "Your father is a smart man," Mason said finally. "I've spoken to him a dozen times over a fence line. He didn't build what he built by being fooled easily. People don't get fooled by people who are easy to catch." "No," he agreed. "But Walter Hayes spent 40 years reading people. Give him the documents. Let him draw his own conclusions before you tell him what yours are." She was quiet for a long time. "Is that really what you think? Or is that what you think is easiest for me to hear?" He looked up at the sky through the branches, cold and gray and honest. "It's what I think. He might surprise you." "And if he doesn't?" "Then you have a harder problem, and you deal with it then." He paused. "You can't solve the problems you haven't gotten to yet." She breathed out slowly. "How are you doing this?" "Doing what?" making this feel like it has steps, like there's an order to it. Because there is. I know there is, but... She stopped. When I'm inside it, all I can see is how many things can go wrong simultaneously. And you put it in sequence, and it sounds like something that can actually be done. He almost said, that's what I used to be paid for. Instead, he said, breakfast first. Everything else second. A pause. What? You haven't eaten yet. How do you... Because you answered on the first ring, and it's 7:30 in the morning, and you sound like someone who's been up since 5. He turned back toward the house. Eat something. Then call your securities attorney and confirm Thursday, and find a way to meet with Diane Cho before the end of the week. You're giving me homework. I'm giving you a sequence. It's not the same thing. She made a sound that was almost a laugh. Almost, but not quite. Too tired and too pressured for anything fully committed to lightness. Okay. I'll eat breakfast. And coffee, he said. Actual coffee, not whatever they sell in airport kiosks. This time she did laugh, brief and surprised. I'm in a hotel in Denver. Hotel coffee is worse than airport coffee, so lower your expectations accordingly. He hung up and went back to the house. Emma was in the kitchen in her fox pajamas, standing in front of the open refrigerator like she expected it to make a suggestion. There's eggs, Mason said. I know, I'm trying to decide if I want eggs. The decision-making process would be faster if you closed the refrigerator. Emma closed it, turned around, looked at him with the particular sharpness she got sometimes, that thing where she was 9 years old and also somehow older than that. Were you outside? In the orchard? Were you on the phone? Emma, I'm just asking. Scrambled or fried? She considered this with inappropriate gravity. Scrambled, but not too mixed up. I know. He cracked the eggs into the pan. Emma climbed onto her stool and pulled her homework folder from her backpack, and the kitchen filled up with the ordinary morning sounds, and Mason stood at the stove and thought about Diane Cho and Walter Hayes and the shape of what was coming. Olivia met with Diane Cho on Wednesday afternoon. She texted Mason a single line afterward. She cried. She's in. He was in the middle of fixing a gate latch when he read it. He stood there for a second, holding the screwdriver, thinking about what that meant. Not just for the evidence, but for Diane Cho herself. 11 years with a company. A woman who had kept quiet about something that bothered her, the way people kept quiet about things that scared them, and then someone finally asked her directly, and something inside her broke open. The notes she handed over were 53 pages. She'd been keeping them for 6 years. He found that out on Thursday evening when Olivia called from a coffee shop near the securities attorney's office, speaking in a voice that was lower and more deliberate than he'd heard from her yet. She has board meeting notes going back to 2018, Olivia said. Not just minutes, notes. Conversations that happened before the formal session started, side conversations after. One entry, from March of last year, has Victor saying to Lawrence Pratt, I'm reading from Diane's handwriting here. If she starts asking questions about the advisory structure, just slow her down. She'll move on. She always does. Mason was sitting at the kitchen table. Emma was upstairs. He was very still. She always does, Olivia repeated. The way she said it told him she'd been sitting with those words all afternoon. He's been dismissing me as predictable for at least a year. I have never... She stopped. I have never let anyone talk to me that way. Now you have evidence he did. Yes. Something had shifted in her voice. The uncertainty that had been there since the first day at the fence line, that careful, contingent quality of someone who was operating on incomplete information and knew it, was still there, but it was furged with something harder now, something that didn't have any give in it. I want to destroy him. I know, Mason said. Tell me I'm not letting this get personal. I can't tell you that. Why not? Because it is personal, he said. It's been personal since the first time he decided you weren't paying attention. You'd be lying to yourself if you said otherwise. He leaned back in his chair. The question isn't whether it's personal. The question is whether it's also right. And it is. So both things can be true. She was quiet. Mason, she said. Yeah? Thursday, November 14th. If we get through that, I want to know who you used to be. The real version, not the farmer version. He looked at the kitchen wall, at the old wood, the worn paint, the shapes of a life he'd built with his hands because his hands needed something to do, and his mind needed something to do, and his heart needed somewhere to put itself. Let's get through it first, he said. Outside, the wind came down off the mountains and pressed against the windows, and the house creaked the way old houses creak. Not weakness, just age, just the sound of something that had been standing a long time and was planning to keep standing. He told himself he wasn't afraid. He told himself that. And then he sat at the table alone in the quiet house and let himself feel the fear, because that was the other thing he'd learned. You couldn't outrun it, and you couldn't pretend it wasn't there, and you couldn't let it decide anything. You just felt it, and then you kept going. The calendar on the wall said October 22nd. 3 weeks. He picked up his legal pad and turned to a clean page. The forensic accountant's name was Patricia Vile, and she didn't like being rushed. Olivia had found her through the securities attorney, a woman named Ruth Nakamura, who had spent 20 years doing Delaware corporate litigation and had the specific kind of calm that came from having seen everything twice. Ruth had called Patricia on a Tuesday and explained the broad shape of the situation without specifics, and Patricia had called Olivia on Wednesday morning and said, before anything else, I need 6 weeks minimum for something like this. I have 3, Olivia said. Then you need a different accountant. I need you. Ruth said you're the best at this kind of structure. Ruth is correct, which is why I know 6 weeks is the minimum. Patricia. Olivia was standing in the parking garage beneath her hotel, which had become her unofficial office because she didn't trust the hotel room's walls, and she didn't trust the lobby, and she didn't trust any space that might have ears she couldn't account for. If this vote goes forward without documented evidence of the compensation structure and the Vantage Holdings connection, 3 people on my board will receive $30 million to ratify a fraudulent acquisition, and my company will spend the next 5 years trying to survive a liability it never should have taken on. A pause on the line. Tell me about Vantage Holdings, Patricia said. Olivia told her. Another pause, longer. Send me the subsidiary agreement tonight. I'll tell you what I can do by Friday. That was how it started. Not cleanly, not on Olivia's schedule, not the way she'd have preferred, but moving, which Mason had told her twice was the thing to focus on. Not whether the conditions were right, whether things were moving. She called him that evening from the parking garage. She'd started doing that without fully acknowledging to herself that she was doing it, finding moments in the day to call, usually in the evenings, usually when the noise of everything had gotten to a pitch that required somewhere quiet to put it down. He answered the way he always answered, like he'd been in the middle of something and wasn't surprised to be interrupted. She told him about Patricia. He said that was good. She told him about the parking garage, and he said she needed a better office. She said she was working on it. How's Emma? She asked. She wasn't sure why she asked. It surprised her a little that it came out before anything else. She's arguing about long division, he said. Says it's inefficient because calculators exist. She's not wrong. Don't tell her that. Too late. You've talked to my 9-year-old about long division? She texted me on Wednesday. From your phone, I assume. She wanted to know if I thought math past basic arithmetic was useful in business. A pause. I'm going to have a conversation with her about using my phone without asking. She made a compelling case. She said executives delegate the calculations anyway. Olivia leaned against the concrete pillar. She's not wrong about that either. She's going to use you as a reference for this argument, you know. I'm aware. I told her that long division builds structural thinking, not just calculation. She said that was a very corporate answer. A pause. She's funny. Yeah, Mason said. Something in his voice shifted when he said it. Not dramatic, just the slight change in register that happened when he talked about Emma. A loosening of something that was otherwise held fairly tight. She is. They were quiet for a second. Can I ask you something? Olivia said. You can ask. The Chicago number, the 312 area code. Someone texted you the weekend after I left Cedar Hollow. I know because, I should tell you this, I asked Ruth to run a basic background check, not deep, just to know who I was trusting. She'd been sitting on that for a week, deciding whether to say it. She'd finally decided that not saying it was a worse kind of dishonesty. Silence on the line. Not angry. She couldn't tell if he was angry, just quiet. "What did the background check say?" he said finally. "Not much. It's impressively clean for someone your age. There's a gap between 2015 and 2019, essentially nothing. Before that, a name associated with Hartwell Meridian Capital in New York, Associate Director of Structured Finance." The concrete of the parking garage was cold against her shoulder. She shifted but didn't move away from the pillar. "I'm not going to apologize for checking," she said, "but I am telling you that I checked because I think you deserve to know." "Hartwell Meridian isn't a secret," he said. "It's in public records." "I know, but the gap is interesting. The gap is when my wife died and I moved to Colorado." She hadn't expected the flatness of it. Not coldness, just the quality of something stated as fact, without buffer. She felt the weight of it land and didn't try to deflect it. "I'm sorry," she said. "It was 4 years ago." "That doesn't mean I shouldn't say it." Another pause, longer. "Her name was Claire," he said. "She was a high school biology teacher. She grew up in Telluride and she thought New York was interesting for about a year before she decided she'd been right the first time, and small mountains were better than big cities." A pause. "She died in a car accident in March of 2019. Black ice on Route 145. Emma was 5. Olivia didn't say anything. She'd learned in the 2.5 weeks of knowing Mason Reed that there were moments where words were the wrong response. This was one. "The 312 number," Mason said, after a moment. "Old colleague. We had a complicated history. I don't talk to him." "He texted you." "I told him he had the wrong person." "Did he believe you?" "Doesn't matter." She wasn't sure that was true, but she also knew she'd pushed about as far as was reasonable tonight. She filed it away, not to ignore but to return to later, when she had more context and he had more reason to trust her with it. "Hartwell Meridian," she said. "Associate Director of Structured Finance. That explains the documents. Some of it. More than some. The way you read that subsidiary agreement, you weren't reading it like a lawyer. You were reading it like someone who designed those structures." He didn't confirm or deny it. She hadn't expected him to, not yet. "Get some sleep," he said. "You have a meeting with Patricia on Friday." "I haven't told you what time the meeting is." "You said she'd tell you what she could do by Friday. Patricia Weil, if she's as good as Ruth says, won't do it by phone. She'll want to meet in person." Olivia looked down the length of the parking garage. Cold fluorescent light, the smell of concrete and exhaust. Her car 2 levels down, a hotel room with documents spread across every flat surface. "You know," she said, "it's genuinely unsettling how often you're right." "I'm wrong plenty," he said. "You just haven't seen it yet." She wasn't sure if that was a warning or a promise. Maybe both. She said goodnight and drove back to the hotel and didn't sleep well, which had become its own kind of routine. Patricia Weil met her at a conference room in Ruth Nakamura's office on Friday morning. She was a small woman in her early 60s with reading glasses she kept pushing up and forgetting about, and the specific air of someone who had spent a career being underestimated and had made consistent, excellent use of that. She'd spent 2 days with the subsidiary agreement, the due diligence reports, and the Vantage Holdings registration records. She had a legal pad covered in notations that she kept face down on the table while she talked, like a card player who wasn't ready to show her hand. "The structure is elegant," Patricia said. She didn't say it admiringly. She said it the way a surgeon might describe a tumor that had been particularly clever about hiding. Whoever designed it knew exactly how far you could push the deferred compensation without triggering automatic disclosure requirements. "Langford?" Olivia asked. "He's the one visible at the surface, but this architecture," she tapped the legal pad. "This took expertise I wouldn't automatically associate with a CFO, even a sophisticated one. There's a level of structured finance knowledge in how this was layered that's coming from somewhere specific." Meaning? Meaning someone designed this for him, or with him. Someone who knows how these vehicles are constructed from the inside. She looked at Olivia over the reading glasses. "Do you have any visibility into Langford's external relationships? Prior employers, advisory relationships, people he might have worked with before Hayes? Olivia made a note. I can find out. Do that. Patricia opened the legal pad. Now, the Vantage Holdings connection. I found 3 additional documents in the public record, a Delaware annual report and 2 registered agent filings that firm up the ownership chain. The principal officer of the acquisition target, a man named Gary Elston, is the indirect majority owner of Vantage Holdings through a personal trust called the Elston Family Trust. She said it like a fact, clean and dry. That trust is also a named beneficiary in the Strathmore Advisory Group Operating Agreement, Section 11, page 44. The deferred compensation doesn't just connect to a company Elston controls. It also provides him personally with a residual economic interest contingent on the acquisition closing. Olivia sat very still. He's paying our board members out of his own trust. A structure he controls, yes. And he benefits personally if the deal closes. He does. So the acquisition target is paying our board to approve a sale, and the money is coming partly from the personal wealth of the seller, which means he's essentially bribing the people who are supposed to protect our interests. That's one way to describe it. Patricia picked up her pen. A securities attorney would describe it in terms of specific violations. But yes, that's what this is. Olivia stood up and walked to the window. Denver below her, the Rockies in the distance. That particular fall light that made the mountains look closer than they were. She pressed the heel of her hand against the glass. Can you build the full documentation by November 12th? She said. I need 2 days before the board meeting. If I have access to the forensic accounting team at my firm starting Monday, yes. You'll have it. I'll also need a clean line of authorization from you personally, not the company. You personally. The moment this goes into the company's legal structure, there's a risk someone tips Langford. Understood. She turned from the window. Patricia, is this enough to stop the vote? Patricia was quiet for a moment, which was itself an answer of a kind. It's enough to create serious legal exposure for everyone involved. Whether that stops the vote depends on whether Langford decides the exposure is real before November 14th. She paused. People in his position often don't believe the exposure is real until they're standing in front of it. So I might need to show him the evidence before the board meeting. That's a strategic choice, not an accounting one. She looked at Olivia levelly. What does your instinct tell you? Olivia thought about what Mason had said 3 weeks ago about the kind of person who built 8-year structures with this much patience. They don't react gracefully when the structure is threatened. My instinct says he'll come at me harder if he knows I'm coming, she said, which means I need to be faster than he is. She drove back to the hotel and called Mason before she'd even gotten out of the car. She told him everything, Patricia, the Elston Family Trust, the full ownership chain. He listened without interrupting, which was one of the things she'd come to rely on without intending to. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Elston, he said, you know him? I know of him. He was adjacent to some transactions I worked on at Hartwell. Not directly, but the name came up. A pause. He has a pattern of this. There was a deal in 2014 that looked similar, Oregon Distribution Company. It didn't go the way he wanted. What happened? Someone on the inside figured out the structure and walked away before the closing. Who? A beat. It doesn't matter. She sat with that for a second. Mason. It doesn't matter, he said again, and this time the door was clearly closed. What matters is that Elston has done this before and he knows how to manage the fallout. He's going to have contingency plans for the acquisition falling apart. You need to understand what those are before you move. How do I understand his contingency plans? What does he do if the acquisition doesn't close? What's the actual cost to him? She thought about it. He doesn't get the valuation. He has a company that's worth less than the price he was trying to get. He still owns it. And the board members? Pratt, Chung, Holt? They don't get paid. $30 million disappears. So his leverage over your board disappears with the deal, Mason said. Which means if you can kill the deal with enough legal force that the liability of proceeding outweighs the benefit of the compensation, the board members flip. They'd be protecting themselves. Yes. Even Pratt and Chung and Holt. Especially them. When people are in a position like theirs, the most powerful thing you can do is make them believe that the ship is going down and there is exactly one lifeboat. A pause. They will find their way to the lifeboat. And Langford? Langford is different, Mason said. Langford doesn't have the lifeboat option. If this falls apart, his professional exposure is terminal. He'll know that the moment you put the evidence in front of him, which means his move won't be to negotiate, it'll be to discredit. Discredit me. Or the evidence. Or both. She was quiet. She'd known that somewhere. But hearing it from Mason made it more solid, more imminent. How do I protect the evidence? Patricia holds the accountant's report independently. Ruth holds the legal analysis independently. Diane Cho holds the board notes independently. The materials exist in 3 separate places that Langford can't reach simultaneously. He paused. And you need one more thing. What? Your father, he said. Before Langford gets to him, you need to go to Denver and sit down with Walter and show him what you have this week. She'd been avoiding this. She knew she'd been avoiding it. He trusted Victor for 8 years. And you're about to show him that trust was weaponized. That's not easy for anyone. Mason's voice was steady, not without empathy. She'd learned to hear the difference. He was steady with it, not despite it. But if Langford talks to him first, even a suggestion, even a seed of doubt about your motives, it complicates everything. My father is not going to believe Victor Langford over me. No, but he might believe his own reluctance to accept that his judgment was wrong. That's not about believing Victor. That's about not wanting to admit he was fooled. A pause. Go see him. Show him the documents. Let him be angry. Let him feel whatever he feels. And then tell him what you need from him. She looked out through the windshield at the parking garage. She'd spent a lot of time in parking garages this month. She thought about her father, Shah, about his voice on the phone, the way he'd sounded last week when she'd called to say she was working through something, that he shouldn't worry, that it was fine. He'd said, okay, Olivia in the tone that meant he knew it was not fine, but that he'd let her manage it because she always had. He's going to blame himself, she said. Probably. He brought Victor in. He brought Pratt onto the board. He's going to look at this and decide it's his failure. Maybe, Mason said. Or maybe he's going to look at it and decide his daughter is worth going to war for. A pause. I've spoken to Walter Hayes across a fence line a dozen times. He's not a man who collapses when things go wrong. She breathed in, out. How do you know what he's like from fence line conversations? Same way I know anything, Mason said. I pay attention. She went to see her father on Saturday. Walter Hayes lived in a townhouse in Cherry Creek when he was in Denver, which was most of the time anymore. He was 71, still straight-backed, with a full head of white hair and the hands of someone who had never been entirely comfortable sitting still. He opened the door when she knocked and looked at her face and said, without preamble, "How bad?" She told him over 2 hours. She put the documents on his kitchen table, the subsidiary agreement, the Vantage Holdings filings, Diane Cho's notes, Patricia Wiles' preliminary analysis, and she walked him through it in order, the way Mason had walked her through things, in sequence, without editorializing, letting the information carry its own weight. Walter read everything she put in front of him. He asked 2 questions in the first hour, both precise, both aimed at confirming his understanding of the ownership chain. In the second hour, he didn't say anything at all. He just read, his reading glasses low on his nose, his hands flat on the table. When she finished, he took his glasses off and set them down and looked at the wall for a while. "Victor," he said. "Yes." 8 years. Yes. He was quiet for a long time. Olivia waited. She'd learned from Mason that some silences needed to be let out. "I pushed for this acquisition," Walter said. "He came to me directly, came to my house, actually, brought the initial proposal in person, said he wanted my blessing before he took it to the board." He paused. "I felt, flattered probably, that he came to me. I didn't read it as manipulation." "Dad, I'm telling you what happened," he said. Not sharp, just direct. The same directness she'd grown up with and sometimes found hard, and now found, sitting at this kitchen table, like something to hold on to. He was grooming me. Not the board, me first, because he knew if I was behind it, the board would follow. He set his jaw. I was the easiest target in the room. You weren't the target, you were Olivia. He looked at her. Don't manage me. I'm not fragile. She stopped. Okay? Tell me what you need. November 14th, she said. I need your vote. You have it. And I need you to call Edmund Park. Edmund Park was one of the two remaining uncompromised board members. A technology investor, methodical, private. Not to tell him everything, just to sound him out, gauge where he stands. And if he's already been talked to, then I need to know that before the 12th. Her father nodded, put his glasses back on and looked at the documents again. This forensic accountant, is she good? Ruth Nakamura recommended her. Ruth is excellent. He turned a page. And your source? For the initial direction. Who saw this first and pointed you toward it? She paused. Someone I trust. He looked at her over the glasses. Olivia. Someone outside the company. Someone with no stake in the outcome. She held his gaze. I'll tell you who it is when this is done. I promised. Walter looked at her for a long moment, evaluating not her honesty, she thought, but the shape of what she wasn't saying. He'd always been good at the shape of things. Is this person a good person? He said. She thought about Mason, about muddy boots and a 9-year-old who argued about long division, about 7 pages of handwritten notes, and a man who had walked away from everything twice, once from an industry and once from ambition, because each time the cost got too high, and he knew it, and he paid it. Yes, she said. He's a good person. Her father nodded, as if that settled something. Maybe it did. She drove back to the hotel and sat in the parking garage for 10 minutes before she could bring herself to go inside. She was tired in a way that wasn't about sleep, the kind of tired that came from running at full capacity in a direction that required everything you had and then asking yourself to have more. She'd been doing that for weeks. She could keep doing it. She just needed to not pretend it wasn't costing her. She called Mason. I talked to him, she said. How did it go? He called himself the easiest target in the room. Then he told me not to manage him. She rested her head back against the headrest. He has Victor's direct cell number memorized. He looked at those documents for 2 hours and didn't lose his composure once. Did you expect him to? I don't know what I expected. She closed her eyes for a second. He asked me if my source was a good person. What did you say? I said yes. Silence on the line. Not uncomfortable, just the particular quiet that Mason inhabited between things. She'd noticed that about him, the way he didn't rush to fill gaps. The 12th is 12 days away, she said. Patricia needs the full forensic report done. Ruth is working on the legal brief. My father is calling Edmund Park. And I still don't know what Langford is doing. He's watching, Mason said. For what? Movement. He'll be looking for signs that you know something, anything that changes your behavior around the acquisition. New attorneys, new questions to the finance team, conversations with board members he hasn't sanctioned. He paused. You need to look exactly the same as you've looked for the past month. Normal. Normal. Cooperative. Ask Victor a routine question about the acquisition next week. Something innocuous. Make him think you're engaged but not suspicious. That feels like lying. It is lying, Mason said. Is that a problem? She thought about it honestly. No, she said finally. Not for this. Good. She watched a car circle the parking level above her, headlights sweeping across the concrete ceiling. Mason, the 2014 deal in Oregon, the distribution company. You said someone figured out the structure and walked away. He didn't say anything. That was you, she said. You were the one who walked away. The silence lasted long enough that she thought he might just not answer. Then, there were 7 families who had pension funds tied up in the acquisition target, small amounts, individually, but it was what they had. If the deal had closed the way Elston structured it, those funds would have been wiped out inside 3 years when the liabilities surfaced. A pause. I wrote a memo. I walked it up the chain at Hartwell. I was told the deal was moving forward, and the memo had been noted. They ignored you. They told me to note my objection for the record and then participate in closing the deal, because the fee was significant and because the firm's relationship with Elston was more valuable than 7 families in Oregon. He stopped. I didn't close the deal. I quit the same week. And Claire? Claire said. He stopped again. When he started again, his voice was the same flatness she'd heard before. Fact without buffer. She said she was proud of me and also terrified because we had a 2-year-old and no plan, and then she said she trusted me to figure it out. A pause. She had a better opinion of me than I probably deserved. Olivia was very still in the car. The parking garage was cold and the light was wrong, and she was talking to a man she'd known for less than a month about the shape of his life, and somehow it felt less strange than it should. Mason, she said, you've been helping me because of the Oregon deal. I've been helping you because what's happening to your company is wrong, he said. The Oregon deal is why I know what that looks like. There's a difference? Yes, he said. She believed him. She wasn't entirely sure why, but she did. November 12th, she said. Can you come to Denver? He was quiet for a moment. Emma has school. I know, just for the day, just to go through everything with me and Patricia and Ruth before we move. I need to know the structure is right before I walk into that board meeting. And you see things in it that... She stopped. You see things none of us are seeing. Another long pause. I'll figure out Emma, he said, finally. You're sure? I said I'll figure it out. She exhaled. Thank you. Get some sleep, Olivia. Stop telling me to sleep. Stop giving me reasons to. She went inside. She ate something from room service, soup, which reminded her of his kitchen, and she let it. And she went through the day's notes and added 3 items to the sequence list she kept on her legal pad. And she did not sleep particularly well, but she slept, which was the best she could say for most of the past 3 weeks. In Cedar Hollow, Mason sat at the kitchen table for a while after he hung up. The house was quiet. The calendar on the wall said November 1st, which meant he'd been inside this thing for 3 weeks already, and the center of gravity had shifted in a way he'd known it would and had not been able to prevent. He'd told Olivia he would figure out Emma. He thought about that. He thought about who he could call. Mrs. Kellerman from up the road, who had watched Emma before when he had to be somewhere. Emma would complain, would say she was too old for a sitter, and then would spend 4 hours playing cards with Mrs. Kellerman and come home full of cookies and information about the Korean War because Mrs. Kellerman's husband had been in the Korean War and she believed in historical education as a byproduct of card games. He thought about what it meant to go to Denver, to sit in an attorney's office with documents he'd spent 3 weeks building from the outside, to walk into the room as whatever he was, like not a farmer, not a financial strategist, something in between that didn't have a clean name. He thought about what came after, if it worked. About the part where explanations were required. About Walter Hayes asking who the source was, and Olivia saying she'd promised to tell him when it was done. He'd known that was coming from the beginning. He'd gone in with his eyes open. He picked up the legal pad, turned to the sequence he'd been building. Everything that needed to happen between now and November 14th, every step in order, every dependency mapped. He'd updated it 3 times this week as new information came in. It was 11 pages now. Clean, detailed, structured the way only someone who had built these things from the inside could structure them. He looked at it for a long time. Then he picked up the phone and called Mrs. Kellerman. Mrs. Kellerman said yes without hesitation, which was the thing about Mrs. Kellerman. She was 73 years old and had raised 4 children and buried a husband and still managed to treat every request for help as if it were a reasonable and expected part of the day. She said she'd be at the house by 7:30 Thursday morning. She said Emma could help her make pierogi if she finished her homework first. She said Mason should drive carefully on Route 550 if it had snowed overnight. He thanked her and hung up and felt the specific, complicated gratitude of someone who had people in his life who would show up, even when he'd spent years telling himself he didn't need people to show up. Emma took the news the way Emma took most things, with a negotiation. Pierogi, she said at breakfast Wednesday. From scratch? That's between you and Mrs. Kellerman. Last time she made me help roll the dough for an hour. That's called cooking. That's called labor. Emma, She stabbed at her scrambled eggs. Where are you going? Denver, for the day. For the Olivia thing? He looked at her. What do you know about the Olivia thing? I know she calls you a lot, and you go outside to talk, and when you come back in, you make that face. What face? Emma demonstrated. Jaw set, eyes slightly unfocused, the look of someone processing something complicated while pretending to be present. It was an uncomfortably accurate impression. I don't make that face, he said. You make that face constantly. He drank his coffee. It's a business matter. I'm helping her with something. Is she in trouble? She's working through something difficult. That's different from trouble. Emma considered this with the seriousness she applied to most things. Is she going to be okay? He looked at his daughter, at the fox pajamas she still refused to replace, at the crease on her cheek from the pillow, at the very particular brand of direct concern she'd inherited from a woman who had never been afraid to ask the real question underneath the surface question. Yes, he said. She's going to be okay. Emma nodded, went back to her eggs. You should bring her something from Denver, like a souvenir. Denver doesn't have souvenirs. It's not a tourist town. Everywhere has souvenirs. I'm going there for a meeting, not to shop. You could do both? He let that go and drove her to the end of the driveway to wait for the bus, same as every morning, and watched her climb on and watched it disappear. And then he went inside and packed a bag for the day. The legal pad, the laptop, a printed copy of the 11-page sequence document, because he didn't trust printing from anywhere in Denver, and drove out of Cedar Hollow on a gray November morning with the mountains at his back and something he hadn't felt in years sitting quiet and complicated in his chest. He recognized it eventually. It took him most of Route 550 to name it. By the time he hit Montrose, he had it. It was the feeling of being good at something that mattered. He'd spent 3 years farming, and he was good at farming. Not exceptional, not in the way that farming could make a man exceptional, but competent and careful and genuinely present for it. And it mattered. The farm mattered. Emma mattered. The life mattered. But this was different. This was the specific sensation of a mind operating at full capacity in a situation where full capacity was exactly what was needed. He didn't miss it, exactly, but he recognized it. Like a language you'd stopped speaking that was suddenly in the room again. He got to Denver at 9:15. Ruth Nakamura's office was on the 14th floor of a building in lower downtown, the kind of space that communicated competence without performing it. Clean lines, working bookshelves, a conference room with a whiteboard that had been used recently. Patricia Weil was already there when he arrived. Olivia was standing at the window with coffee, and she turned when he came in and something in her face changed. Not dramatically, just a small release of tension that she probably wasn't aware of. You made it, she said. Said I would. She looked at him for a second. He was wearing the cleanest version of his regular clothes, dark jeans, a flannel shirt, a jacket that was functional but not expensive. He hadn't owned a suit in 4 years. She was in a charcoal blazer and looked like she hadn't slept more than 5 hours, which he suspected was generous. This is Patricia, she said. Patricia Weil looked up from the documents she was organizing. She assessed him in about 2 seconds with the efficient attention of someone who evaluated things for a living. You're the farmer, she said. That's right. Ruth told me you were the one who identified the Vantage Holdings structure. I followed the footnote on page 91, he said. Anyone could have. They didn't, though. She turned back to the documents. Sit down. We have a lot to go through. They worked for 4 hours. Ruth ran the legal analysis from one end of the table. Patricia ran the forensic accounting from the other. Mason sat in the middle with his legal pad and listened to both of them and said almost nothing for the first hour, taking notes, building a picture. The picture was complex but coherent. The evidence was solid, better than he'd expected at this stage. Patricia had identified 3 additional layers in the Vantage Holdings ownership chain that created a direct paper trail from Gary Elston's personal trust to the deferred compensation payments. Ruth had drafted a legal brief that laid the violations out in sequence, clean and unambiguous. Olivia watched Mason the way she'd been watching him for a month, with the particular attention of someone trying to understand something they couldn't quite classify. He was aware of it. He let it be. At the end of the first hour, he said, "The brief needs one thing." Ruth looked up. "Tell me." "The ERISA exposure is understated. There are 2 pension administrators who hold positions in Hayes Logistics. I found their 13F filings last week. If those fund managers are construed as having material non-public information about the acquisition given their board relationships, the potential liability isn't just to the company, it's personal. To Pratt and Chung specifically." He turned the legal pad so Ruth could see the notation. "That changes their calculus significantly. It's not just that they won't get paid, it's that they could face personal civil liability for breach of fiduciary duty." Ruth looked at the notation, then at Patricia, then at Mason. "How long have you been looking at 13F filings?" "Since 2 weeks ago." "You found this in 2 weeks." "I had time," he said. "The farm is quiet at night." Olivia made a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been disbelief. Possibly both. Ruth rewrote the relevant section of the brief over lunch, working through it quickly, her handwriting fast and precise, asking Mason 2 questions that he answered and 1 question he didn't have the answer to, and said so, which seemed to satisfy her in a different way. Patricia refined the forensic report's executive summary to include the personal liability angle. Mason went through the full presentation structure 3 times, looking for gaps. There was one. "The board meeting," he said, at 2 o'clock. "Langford controls the agenda. He'll know something is coming before the vote. He's been watching her for weeks. He'll see the shift. His first move when he knows will be to call for a procedural delay. He'll argue the vote needs to be rescheduled pending review of new information, or that there's a conflict of interest allegation that needs to be reviewed by independent counsel before the board can act." "Can he do that?" Olivia asked. "Under the company's bylaws?" "Ruth?" Ruth had been expecting this. "He can request a delay. He can't compel one. The chair has discretion." "Who chairs the board?" "Lawrence Pratt," Olivia said. "Who is compromised." "Yes." Mason looked at the table. "Then you need to remove Pratt from the chair before the meeting starts, or neutralize his ability to exercise chair discretion." "How?" "Your bylaws allow for an emergency appointment of an acting chair if the sitting chair has a disclosed conflict. If Pratt's conflict is documented and disclosed before the meeting opens, he's required to recuse from chair responsibilities." He looked at Ruth. "Is that accurate?" Ruth pulled the bylaws document from her stack, read for 45 seconds. Section 8.3. Yes. "Conflict disclosure before the meeting opens triggers mandatory recusal from procedural authority." She looked up. "The conflict needs to be formally disclosed in writing to all board members simultaneously." "So we send the evidence to the full board the morning of the 14th, Olivia said, "before the meeting opens." "Not the full forensic report," Mason said. "That goes to the independent directors only. Your father, Edmund Park, and the 7th member." He looked at Olivia. "Who is the 7th?" "Margaret Tan. She's been on the board for 3 years. She's clean. I'm certain of that. Send the full package to those 3 the night before. Send a conflict disclosure letter to Pratt, Chung, and Holt simultaneously on the morning of the 14th, 2 hours before the meeting. The letter references the forensic report and the legal brief and states that their deferred compensation interest in Strathmore Advisory Group constitutes a material conflict requiring recusal from the acquisition vote." He paused. "Langford gets a copy of the conflict disclosure letter at the same time. He doesn't get the full package." "Why not?" "Because the full package goes to the SEC simultaneously, and you want Langford to know that the package exists and has been filed, but you don't want him to know exactly what's in it until he's already in the room with nowhere to go." The conference room was quiet for a moment. "You're going to box him in," Patricia said. "I'm going to help Olivia box him in," Mason said. "She's going to be the one in the room." He said it without looking at Olivia, but he felt her looking at him. Ruth was making notes quickly. "The SEC filing would need to happen through external counsel, not me. I have a conflict of interest once I'm involved in the board strategy. You need a securities enforcement specialist." "I have one," Olivia said. "My securities attorney has a partner who does enforcement work. I'll call her this afternoon." "Good," Ruth capped her pen. "Mason, one question." "Go ahead." When Langford is in that room and he realizes what's happening, what does he do? Mason looked at the window. Downtown Denver in November, the sky doing its complicated gray and white thing over the Rockies. He thought about what he knew about men like Langford, about the specific psychology of someone who had spent 8 years building something patient and structural and was now watching it come apart in a single morning. He'll try to make it about her, Mason said. Not the evidence. Her. He'll argue she's acted improperly, that she's conducted an outside investigation that violated company policy, that she's breached confidentiality obligations by involving external parties. He paused. He'll try to make the board question her judgment rather than the evidence. How does she handle that? She doesn't defend herself. She lets the documents do it. He finally looked at Olivia. Every time he says something about you, you say, "Here's the document." Every time he questions your motives, you say, "Here's the document." You don't argue with him about intent or character. You put the evidence on the table and you let it sit there. Because he can argue with you, but he can't argue with a Delaware registered agent filing. Olivia looked at him for a long moment. You've been in a room like this before. I've been in rooms adjacent to it. What happened? He held her gaze. Different outcome. Different people. A pause. I wasn't on the right side of the table. The room absorbed that. Ruth looked at her notes. Patricia looked at her documents. Olivia didn't look away. Thank you, she said, quietly, just to him, for being here. He nodded and looked back at the window and didn't say anything because there wasn't anything that needed saying. They broke at 3:30. Ruth and Patricia stayed to finalize their respective documents. Olivia walked Mason to the elevator, and they stood in the hallway outside Ruth's office in the particular quiet of a space between things. November 14th, Olivia said. That's 5 days. I know. After it's done, she stopped. You said you'd tell me who you used to be, the real version. I said, let's get through it first. We're almost through it. Almost isn't through. She looked at him. She'd gotten better at reading his silences, or thought she had at least. She'd gotten better at knowing the ones that were closed and the ones that were just waiting. This one, she thought, was waiting. Will you come, she said, to Denver for the meeting? You don't need me in the meeting. I know I don't need you. I'm asking if you'll come. She said it straight, without apology for asking. He'd come to appreciate that about her. The directness that had read as corporate in the first week and read as something entirely different now. I'd like you to be there. He looked at the elevator doors. I'll see about Mrs. Kellerman again. That's not a no. No, he said. It's not. He drove back to Cedar Hollow in the dark, the mountains invisible on either side, but present the way they always were, a weight and a scale that made the valley feel held rather than small. He thought about November 14th. He thought about the room. He thought about what it would mean to watch Olivia Hayes walk into it with everything they'd built and put it on the table in front of the people who'd been trying to take her apart. He thought about Claire, briefly, the way he sometimes did at night in the car. Not the whole of her, just a moment. He kept a few of them specifically, like objects on a shelf. This one was from 2 weeks before she died. They'd been sitting on the porch of the farmhouse in early March, too cold for it, really, blankets over their laps, Emma asleep inside. Claire had been looking at the mountains and she'd said, out of nowhere, "You're going to be useful to people again someday. You know that, right?" And he'd said, "I'm useful to you and Emma." And she'd said, "That's not what I mean, and you know it." He pulled into the farm at 9:15. Mrs. Kellerman had left a light on in the kitchen window, which she always did when she watched Emma in the evening. He sat in the truck for a minute before he went in. Useful to people again someday. He hadn't wanted it. He'd made his peace, or thought he had, with not wanting it. And then Olivia Hayes had stood at a fence line with a manila folder and asked about an easement, and the thing inside him that was good at this, the specific structural, load-bearing part of his mind, had woken up like it had been waiting for exactly that. He went inside. Emma was asleep on the couch with a book on her chest and pierogi crumbs on her shirt, and the very specific expression of someone who had fallen asleep fully intending to stay awake. He stood there looking at her for a moment, then carried her upstairs and put her to bed without waking her, which he'd been doing since she was 5, and which she was, technically, too old for, and which he was not going to stop doing. He called Olivia when he got back to the kitchen. "The securities enforcement attorney," he said when she picked up. "Has she been briefed on the personal liability angle?" "I called her at 4:30. Ruth is sending her the brief tonight." "Good. And Edmund Park, so your father confirmed he's committed?" "My father called me an hour ago. Edmund Park is in. He's not happy about how this played out, but he's in." A pause. "My father described the conversation as one of the more bracing experiences of his recent life." "Your father's direct." "Diplomatically put." She paused. "He asked about you again." "What did you tell him?" "That you were someone who saw what was happening and decided it mattered enough to do something about it." She paused. "He said that's a rare quality." Mason didn't say anything. He looked at the kitchen, at the paper turkey Emma had made in October, still on the refrigerator, at the whiteboard with multiplication tables and grocery lists, at the worn counter and the cast iron hooks and the box file on the shelf that held the paperwork for a life he'd built with both hands because he'd needed somewhere to put himself. "Mason," Olivia said. "Yeah. The thing you said today, in the conference room, that you weren't on the right side of the table." She paused. "At Hartwell, the 2014 deal." He waited. "You walked away," she said. "You quit the same week you refused to close the deal. That's the right side of the table." "I should have done more than quit." "What else could you have done?" "I could have reported it. I had the documents. I had the same kind of analysis I've been building for you." He looked at the wall. "I chose to leave instead of to fight, and Elston went on and did it again." "You had a 2-year-old, she said, "and a wife who trusted you to figure it out. Quitting when the cost got too high is not the same as being on the wrong side. You're being generous. I'm being accurate. There's a difference." A pause. "You know what the wrong side of that table looks like. You just showed it to me in a conference room in Denver. Langford is the wrong side of the table. Elston is the wrong side of the table. You were the guy who wouldn't do the thing they needed done and walked away instead." She paused. "That matters." He was quiet for a long time. "Get some sleep," he said finally. She laughed, short, real. "You never take your own advice." "That's different." "How?" "I have a farm to run. I have a company to save." "Your company has several hundred employees who can help. My farm has me and a 9-year-old who argues about long division." "Fine. We both need sleep and neither of us is going to get enough." She paused. 5 days. 5 days, he said. He stayed at the kitchen table after he hung up, the house quiet the way it got late at night, just the furnace and the settling sounds and the wind off the mountains. He opened the legal pad to the sequence document and went through it again, looking for anything he'd missed. He didn't find anything new. That was either reassuring or concerning, and he wasn't sure which. The problem with the next 5 days, the thing he hadn't said out loud to anyone, was that they were outside his control. He'd built the structure. He'd found the evidence. He'd mapped the sequence. But November 14th was going to happen in a boardroom in Virginia, and he was going to be... what? At best, in a waiting room outside it, if Mrs. Kellerman agreed to another day. At worst, on a farm in Colorado reading about it afterward. He'd been the person in the room, years ago. He'd sat at those tables, and he'd known what was in every document, and he'd built arguments in his head faster than most people could read. He didn't miss those rooms. But he was aware, sitting at his kitchen table at 11 o'clock on a November night, that he was going to feel the distance from this one. The phone buzzed, a text from Olivia. Just 3 words. "Thank you. Sleep." He looked at it for a moment, then he typed back. "Stop texting. Sleep." And set the phone down. 5 days. He turned off the kitchen light and went upstairs and checked on Emma. Still sleeping, the book from the couch now somehow migrated to her bed, her hair everywhere. And then he went to his room and lay in the dark and thought about tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that, which was not the same as sleeping, but was what he had. The day before the board meeting, Victor Langford called Olivia's cell phone at 8 in the morning. She was in her hotel room in Virginia. She'd flown out on the 12th, the day after the conflict disclosure letters were supposed to go out, the morning after the SEC filing was received and logged. She looked at the screen when it rang and stood up from the desk and walked to the window and answered. "Olivia?" His voice was smooth, controlled, the voice of a man who had decided on a tone and was committed to it. "I think we should talk before tomorrow." "Victor," she said. "Good morning. I received the letter this morning from Ruth Nakamura's office." "I know. And I understand there's been an SEC filing." "Yes." A pause. "I think there's been a serious misunderstanding about the Strathmore structure, the deferred compensation. Victor," she kept her voice level, "I'm not going to discuss this with you outside of the board meeting." "Olivia, I've worked for this company for 8 years. I know how long you've worked here." She looked at the window. The Virginia sky was flat and pale, nothing like the Colorado sky, nothing like the mountains. "Tomorrow morning, if you'd like to address the board, you'll have the opportunity." Another pause. When he spoke again, the smooth tone had something underneath it. Not panic, something colder than panic. Calculation. "You should think very carefully about what you're doing. The board relationships I've built over 8 years, the institutional shareholder relationships. Victor." She said it the same way she'd say it if he were late to a meeting. "I'll see you tomorrow." She hung up and stood at the window for a long time. Then she called Mason. He answered on the second ring. She could hear the barn in the background, some mechanical sound, the tractor maybe. "He called," she said. "I know." "How do you—" "Because it's what I'd do in his position. Create a conversation that happens outside the formal process. Make you feel like there's an opportunity to resolve this quietly." A pause. "What did he say?" "He said there had been a serious misunderstanding about the Strathmore structure." He used the word misunderstanding. "Yes. Not mistake, not error. Misunderstanding." She could hear him thinking. He's already building the defense. A misunderstanding implies good faith on his part. He's going to argue he didn't know about the Elston connection. Can he make that case? Not credibly, not with Diane Cho's notes, but he'll try. A pause. He also mentioned institutional shareholder relationships. He did. That's a threat. He's telling you he can influence how shareholders view tomorrow's outcome. A pause. He's scared. He didn't sound scared. Scared people in positions of power don't sound scared. They sound like they're doing you a favor by warning you. The mechanical sound in the background stopped. She heard him set something down. "Olivia, tomorrow morning, when you walk into that room. However he looks, whatever face he's wearing, he's scared. He has been since the moment the conflict letters went out. Don't let him make you forget that." She pressed her palm against the cold glass. "Are you coming?" she said. A pause. "I'm coming. Flight gets me there by 9. Meeting starts at 10. She exhaled. She hadn't known, until this moment, how much that mattered. She'd told herself she didn't need him in the room. She'd told herself she had everything she needed. Ruth, Patricia's report, her father's vote, Edmund Park's vote, Margaret Tan's vote. She had the majority. She had the evidence. She had the sequence. She still needed him to be there. She wasn't entirely sure what that said about her, but she'd stopped apologizing to herself for things that were real. "Thank you," she said. "I'm not doing anything. I'm sitting in a waiting room." "Mason?" "Yeah." "You've been doing everything." She said it simply, without performance. "I know that." He didn't say anything for a second. When he did, his voice had that quality she'd come to recognize, the slight roughness of something true pushing through the flatness. "Get ready for tomorrow," he said. "You know everything you need to know." "Do I?" "Every question he's going to ask, you can answer with a document. Every claim he makes, you can refute with a document. You know this better than he does now." A pause. "That's the thing about building a case for 6 weeks. By the time you walk into the room, you've lived inside it long enough that it's yours. It's not his story anymore. It's yours." She stood at the window and felt the weight of the next 18 hours. And underneath the weight, something else. Something she hadn't felt in long enough that she'd almost forgotten what it was called. Readiness. The specific kind that came not from certainty, but from preparation, from having done the work, from having someone beside you who also did the work and didn't need you to pretend it was simple. "Get some sleep," she said. "You too," he said. "I'll try." "That's all you can do." She stood at the window for a while after she hung up. The pale Virginia sky. The morning of the 14th, 12 hours away. Everything they'd built, sitting in 3 separate locations, waiting to be put on a table. She went back to the desk, opened Ruth's brief, read it one more time from the beginning. She already knew every word of it. She read it anyway. The flight from Denver landed at Dulles at 8:52. Mason had taken the first flight out of Grand Junction, which meant he'd been up at 4 driving in the dark on roads that were still and empty and cold in the way that only mountain roads are cold before sunrise, a specific, total kind of cold that has nothing casual about it. He'd left the key under the mat for Mrs. Kellerman. He'd left a note on the refrigerator that said pierogi acceptable, cookies in moderation, long division non-negotiable. He'd stood in Emma's doorway for a moment before he left, watching her sleep, and felt the weight of the morning the way you feel things at 4 a.m., without the buffer that daylight provides, without the ability to rationalize them into something manageable. He wasn't afraid of the board meeting. He was afraid of what he'd become inside of it, and whether that version of himself would fit back into the life he'd built when the day was over. The cab from Dulles took 40 minutes. He sat in the back and looked at Northern Virginia through the window. The particular suburban landscape of a place that existed primarily in relation to somewhere else, all strip malls and office parks and roads that were too wide for the traffic they carried. He'd lived in New York for 7 years before Cedar Hollow. He'd forgotten how much of the country looked like this, functional, context-free, the geography of transactions rather than lives. Olivia texted him at 9:20. Building lobby. 12th floor. Don't go to reception. I'll meet you at the elevator. He found her there at 9:40. She was in a dark suit, her hair back, and she looked like exactly what she was. A woman who had prepared for 6 weeks and slept 4 hours and was absolutely not going to let either of those things show in the next 90 minutes. She looked, if he was being honest, formidable, not in a performed way. In the way that people look formidable when they've done the actual work and they know it. She looked at him when the elevator opened. Something in her face did what it always did. That small release of something held too tight. "You're here," she said. "Said I would be." She nodded. "The board members are arriving. Pratt is already upstairs. He looks like a man who hasn't slept." She paused. "Langford isn't here yet." "He'll be exactly on time," Mason said. "People like him use punctuality as a performance. Early means anxious. Late means disrespectful. On time means controlled." She looked at him. "How are you?" The question surprised him, mildly. He hadn't expected her to ask it. She had enough to carry without asking him that. "Fine," he said. "You're allowed to say it's strange. Being here." He looked at the lobby. The marble floors, the security desk, the elevator bank with its brushed steel doors, the specific architecture of corporate consequence. "It's strange," he said. "Thank you for telling the truth." "You asked." She almost smiled. "Ruth and Patricia are already upstairs in a conference room on 11. The board meeting is on 12. You'll be on 11 with them." She paused. "I know that's not—" "It's right," he said. "My being in the room would raise questions that don't need to be raised right now." "I know, I just—" She stopped. "I wanted you to know you could have been in that room. You built everything that's going to happen in it." He looked at her steadily. "You built it. I read the footnotes." She held his gaze for a second. "You're the worst at accepting credit. You're the worst at delegating. We both have things to work on." This time she did smile, brief and real and a little tired. "Okay," she said. "Let's go up." They rode the elevator together in silence. At 11, she walked him to the conference room where Ruth and Patricia were set up. Documents organized, laptops open, a phone on speaker in the center of the table linked to the securities enforcement attorney in Denver. Patricia looked up when he came in and nodded. Ruth said his name as a greeting. He sat at the table and put his legal pad in front of him and looked at the phone and understood that this was his version of the room, not the one on 12, but the one that made 12 possible. Olivia stood in the doorway for a moment. "Okay," she said again. To herself, mostly. The word of someone checking something internal. Then she straightened. Not that she'd been slouching, but there was a quality of alignment that happened, a gathering of everything into one direction. She looked at Mason one more time. He said, "You know everything you need to know." She said, "I know." Then she turned and walked to the elevator, and the doors closed behind her, and it was 10:03 in the morning on November 14th. Ruth put her hand on the phone. "Denver, are you on?" "We're here," said the securities enforcement attorney's voice through the speaker. "SEC filing was confirmed received at 7:42 this morning. We have a case number." "Good," Ruth said. "Now we wait." Mason uncapped his pen, looked at the blank top page of his legal pad. Then he put the pen down and just sat there, because there was nothing left to write. The sequence was complete. Everything that could be done from this room had been done. What happened now happened in the room above them. And in that room there was one person who mattered, and she had everything she needed, and he had to trust that. He was not good at trusting that. He'd never been good at it. His entire career, his entire value, had been the ability to stay inside a problem until he could see the solution in full. Sitting 11 floors up in a building in Northern Virginia, while someone else carried what he'd built into the room where it would either hold or break. This was a specific kind of hard that he hadn't anticipated. He sat with it. That was all he could do. On the 12th floor, the board meeting of Hayes Logistics opened at 10:15, 15 minutes late, because Lawrence Pratt had spent 12 minutes attempting to convince Ruth Nakamura's office by phone that the conflict disclosure letter was procedurally improper, and Ruth's paralegal had spent 12 minutes being professionally unmovable about it. Olivia called the meeting to order herself. There were 7 people in the room: Olivia, Walter Hayes, Edmund Park, Margaret Tahn, Lawrence Pratt, Susan Chung, David Holt. Victor Langford sat at the far end of the table in the position he always occupied. Not the head, that was Pratt's chair under normal circumstances, but the position from which he could see every face in the room simultaneously. He had come in at 10:13, exactly 2 minutes before the scheduled start, and he had looked at Olivia when he sat down with the specific expression of a man who had made a decision and was at peace with it, which she recognized from Mason's warning as the face of someone who was afraid and performing the opposite. She'd put 3 documents in front of every seat: Patricia's forensic report, Ruth's legal brief, and Diane Cho's board meeting notes. Copies. The originals were held separately. She'd placed them face down, the way you placed a hand of cards you were confident in. "Before we address the agenda," Olivia said, "I need to put something in front of the board." Pratt, sitting in his chair without the authority he normally held in it, said, "Olivia, I think we need to discuss the appropriateness of Lawrence." Walter Hayes, his voice quiet, exact, carrying the specific weight of a man who had built something real and was done being patient about what was happening to it. "Let her speak." Pratt closed his mouth. Olivia turned over the documents. She walked the board through it in sequence, the way Mason had walked her through things from the beginning, in order, without editorializing, letting the evidence carry its own weight. Patricia's report first, the ownership chain, the Elston Family Trust, the Strathmore Advisory Group structure, the deferred compensation payments. Then Ruth's brief, the legal analysis, the ERISA exposure, the potential personal civil liability. Then Diane Cho's notes, 6 years of what had actually been said in this room before the session started and after they ended, in the spaces where people said what they actually meant. She read one section from the notes aloud. March of last year, Victor Langford to Lawrence Pratt, recorded in Diane Cho's handwriting. "If she starts asking questions about the advisory structure, just slow her down. She'll move on. She always does." The room was very quiet when she finished reading it. Langford said, "That's taken out of context." Olivia set the document down. Page 31 of Diane Cho's notes, if you'd like to provide the context. "Diane Cho has a personal loyalty to this family that creates significant bias in her." Page 31, Olivia said again. Same tone. What Mason had told her, You don't argue with him about intent or character. You put the evidence on the table and let it sit there. Edmund Park had his copy of the forensic report open. He was reading something near the back. He turned a page, read for a moment, and then said without looking up, "The Elston Family Trust. Is this the same Gary Elston who testified before the Oregon State Legislature in 2016 regarding a failed distribution company acquisition?" The question landed in the room and sat there. Langford's jaw moved. Not much. Enough. That proceeding was resolved without findings. It was resolved with a settlement, Park said. He looked up. I was in private equity in 2016. I remember the case. He looked at Olivia. This is a pattern. Yes, Olivia said. Victor Langford looked at the table, then at Olivia, then at the document in front of him, which he had not yet opened. There was a shift in the room, the kind that happened when the center of gravity moved and everyone felt it simultaneously. Susan Chung had gone still in her chair. David Holt was looking at his copy of the forensic report with the expression of someone who has just realized how far down the hole actually goes. Pratt said, "Victor, was this arrangement disclosed to you?" Langford looked at him, and Olivia watched something happen in that look. Not surprise, but recalculation. The moment a person decides whether the people beside them are allies or liabilities. Lawrence. Because if it wasn't, Pratt said, and his voice had changed, the smooth procedural quality gone, replaced by something rougher and more afraid. Then we have a very different kind of problem than I was led to believe. Olivia understood what was happening. It was exactly what Mason had said. The ship going down, one lifeboat. Lawrence Pratt had just decided which one he was getting into. This acquisition was presented to me as a sound strategic opportunity, Langford said. His voice was still controlled, still smooth, but the smoothness now had an edge to it, the way ice has an edge when it started to thin. The advisory structure was a standard transaction incentive. The disclosure requirements, Victor, Olivia. The SEC received our filing at 7:42 this morning. They have the full forensic report and the legal brief. She paused. This is no longer an internal matter. The room went quiet in a different way than before. Not the quiet of people listening, the quiet of people understanding. Langford looked at her for a long moment. She looked back. She thought about what Mason had said. He's scared. And she held on to it, not as a comfort, but as information, the way you hold on to any piece of data that tells you what you're actually dealing with. I would like to consult with legal counsel, Langford said. You're welcome to leave the room and do that, Olivia said. The board will continue without you. He looked at her one more time. She had the impression, watching him, of something unwinding, not collapsing. He was too controlled for that, but the specific unwinding of a structure that had been under tension for a long time and had finally met something it couldn't hold against. He picked up his copy of the forensic report. He stood. He walked to the door without looking at Pratt or Chung or Holt, which was its own kind of answer about how much those relationships were worth to him when the accounting came due. The door closed. Margaret Tan, who had not spoken yet, said, I'd like to formally move that the acquisition vote be tabled pending a full independent review. Seconded, said Edmund Park. Walter Hayes said, Aye. The vote was 5-0, with Pratt, Chung, and Holt abstaining. They didn't vote against it. Abstaining was the lifeboat. It wasn't a verdict. Olivia knew that. The SEC investigation would take months. The legal proceedings against Langford would be slow and expensive and uncertain in the way that legal proceedings always were. Gary Elston would hire attorneys, and his attorneys would argue, and the truth would have to be established in the exhausting, incremental, deeply unglamorous way that truth usually got established in rooms like these. There would be depositions and filings and requests for continuances and days that felt like nothing was moving, and days where everything moved at once. But the acquisition was dead. The board was intact. The company was still hers. She sat at the table after the others filed out, the documents in front of her, the room quiet now, and let herself feel it. Not triumph, not quite, but something more like relief and something more like exhaustion, and underneath both of those, the specific texture of having done a hard thing and not broken. She'd been afraid she would break. She hadn't told anyone that, not even Mason. But she'd known from the first week in Cedar Hollow that the fear wasn't of losing the company. It was of losing her grip on herself in the process of trying to save it, of becoming someone smaller and more frightened than she wanted to be. She hadn't. She didn't know yet what it had cost her, but she hadn't broken. Her father was the last to leave. He stopped beside her chair and put his hand on her shoulder briefly, just for a second, not a gesture that needed words attached to it. And then he was gone, and she was alone in the room. She picked up her phone and called the number she'd been thinking about for the past hour. Mason answered before the first ring had finished. "Well?" he said. "Langford left the room," she said. Margaret moved to table. 5-0, Pratt's group abstained. A silence on the line. She could hear him breathing. "It held," she said. "Yeah," he said. His voice had something in it she hadn't heard from him before. Not quite emotion, but the particular roughness of someone who has been holding something carefully for a long time and has just been told they can put it down. It held. She realized her hands were shaking slightly. She'd been holding them still for 3 hours. "Come upstairs," she said. "I'll meet you at the elevator." She found him there 2 minutes later. He was in his jacket, his legal pad under his arm, looking exactly like what he was. A farmer from Colorado who had spent 6 weeks reading documents on a kitchen table by lamplight and had built, from that, something that had just held up in a 12th floor boardroom in Virginia. She looked at him for a moment. Then she closed the distance between them and put her arms around him, and he stood very still for exactly 1 second, the second of someone who had been holding themselves at a specific distance from everything for a long time, and wasn't sure what to do with the absence of that distance. And then he put one arm around her and held on. They stayed like that for a while. Not long. Long enough. When she stepped back, she looked at his face. He was looking at the elevator doors. His jaw was set. Something in his eyes that wasn't quite wet, but was close to the territory. "Thank you, Shti," she said. "You did this," he said. "I want to be clear about that." "We did this," she said. "I want to be clear about that." He looked at her. He didn't argue. That was its own kind of progress. "My father is downstairs," she said. "He wants to meet you." Mason was quiet for a second. "You told him." He asked again after the meeting. She held his gaze. "I told him you were the farmer next door who turned out to be the sharpest person I'd ever asked for help." "That's not accurate." "It's entirely accurate." She paused. "He also wants to know why you know Gary Elston." "I don't know Gary Elston." "He knows. He wants to hear your version." She watched him. "Mason, he's a good man, and he knows you saved his company. The least you can do is let him say thank you." Mason looked at the elevator for a long moment. Then he pressed the button. "1 cup of coffee," he said. "I have a flight back at 4. "Of course," she said, and did not point out that she had not suggested anything longer than 1 cup of coffee, because she understood that sometimes people needed to be given the smallest possible version of a thing before they could agree to it. They went downstairs. Walter Hayes was waiting in the lobby, his coat on, his hands in his pockets. He was a tall man, Mason's height, roughly, with the posture of someone who had decided, at some point decades ago, that how you held yourself was a decision you made consciously. He looked at Mason when the elevator opened and assessed him with the same directness his daughter used, which explained a great deal. "Mason Reed," Walter said. "Walter," Mason said. They shook hands, the kind of handshake that was also a conversation, brief, direct, neither of them making it more than it needed to be. "I owe you," Walter said. "You don't," Mason said. "I read some documents and followed some footnotes. Your daughter did the rest." "She told me about the footnotes." Walter looked at him steadily. "She also told me about the 2014 Oregon deal, about Elston." Mason said nothing. "I was on the investment committee of a pension fund in 2014, Walter said. Tier 2 logistics and distribution exposure. We lost $4 million when an Oregon distribution company went into restructuring 2 years after a disputed acquisition." He paused. "That was Elston's deal." Mason looked at him. "I never found out who blew it up," Walter said. "The deal collapsed and Elston walked away, and the story never got properly told. He held Mason's gaze. I'm glad it was you. Mason was quiet for a long moment. It wasn't enough, he said. The families I was trying to protect, they still lost what they had. It just took longer. It bought them 2 years, Walter said, and it documented a pattern that my daughter used 45 days ago to stop the same man from doing it again. He paused. That's enough. Don't argue with me about whether it's enough. Mason looked at him, and something happened in his face. Not a collapse, not anything dramatic. Just the small, particular release of something that had been held under pressure for a long time. The specific quality of a man being told by someone who had reason to know that the thing he'd done mattered, that it had counted, that the cost had not been paid for nothing. He looked down at the floor for a second, breathed once, looked back up. 1 cup of coffee, he said. Then I need to get back. To your farm, Walter said. To my daughter. Walter nodded as if that were the most sensible thing anyone had said all day. They had coffee in a place around the corner. The kind of coffee shop that existed in every American city, warm and slightly too loud and not particularly distinguished, which was exactly right for the occasion. Olivia watched her father and Mason talk and felt something she hadn't expected, the specific satisfaction of 2 things that belong in the same room finally being in the same room. They talked about the farm, about Emma, about the Hayes property, and the fence line and the orchard. Her father asked questions the way he always asked questions, precisely, actually interested in the answers. Mason answered without performing, which was the thing he did that she'd first noticed and kept noticing. He was not a man who dressed himself up for conversations. He just said what he meant and listened to what you said and thought about it before he responded. It was rarer than it should have been. At one point her father said, "The property, your north parcel. There's a water access issue I've been meaning to address. The creek boundary hasn't been surveyed since 1998. I know, Mason said. The survey pins on the east side of the creek don't match the 1992 deed description. Her father blinked. How long have you known that? Since I moved in. Why didn't you say anything? It wasn't a problem. I wasn't going anywhere. Her father looked at him for a moment. Then he laughed. A short, real laugh, the kind he didn't produce often. I like you, he said. That's probably not something you need to hear, but I thought I'd say it. I appreciate it, Mason said. And meant it, she could tell. Mason left for the airport at 2:30. Olivia walked him out of the coffee shop, and they stood on the sidewalk in the pale November afternoon, the city going around them in the normal, indifferent way cities went around people who were standing still inside important moments. Emma, Olivia said, tell her the cheese sandwich idea worked. She'll be insufferable about it. She deserves to be. She's 9, and she contributed meaningfully to a corporate governance crisis. He almost smiled. I'll tell her you said that. She'll put it in her college essay. Perfect. She looked at him. The suit she'd worn all day felt heavy and wrong now, and she wanted to take it off, and she was also aware that she didn't want him to get in the cab yet. Both things were true. Mason. Yeah. What now? She said it simply. Not fishing, not performing uncertainty she didn't feel, just asking. He looked at her for a second. She'd been learning to read his silences for 6 weeks, and she thought she understood this one. It was the silence of someone who knew the answer and was deciding whether the answer was ready to be said. I go back, he said, to the farm, to Emma, to the fence posts I still haven't finished. A pause. And I figure out what this is. This, she said. This. He looked at her steadily. You and me. What we've been doing for 6 weeks. Whether there's something past the thing that brought us together. She held his gaze. And what do you think? I think, he said carefully, that I've spent 4 years building a life that fits exactly who I am right now. And I think you've spent a long time building one that fits exactly who you are. And I don't know yet what it looks like when those 2 things are in the same place. He paused. But I'd like to find out. If that's... Yes, she said, before he could finish the conditional. That's exactly what that is. He looked at her for a moment. Okay, he said. Okay, she said. It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't a resolution in the way that resolutions looked in the version of this story that got told cleanly. It was two people with complicated histories and separate lives, and a daughter who argued about long division, and a company that needed months of repair, and a farm with fence posts that still needed finishing, deciding together that the complication was worth it, that the question was worth asking, that whatever came next was worth finding out. The cab pulled up. He got in. She watched it go. She stood on the sidewalk for a minute after it turned the corner, the cold November air on her face, the city going about its business all around her with complete indifference to the fact that something had just shifted in the shape of her life. Then she went back inside to call her father. The months that followed were not simple. That was the honest version of it, and the only version worth telling. The SEC investigation moved at the pace government investigations move. Methodical, slow, occasionally maddening. Ruth's legal team spent 3 months in depositions. Patricia Weil testified twice. Diane Cho, who had been afraid for 6 years, turned out to be one of the most composed and precise witnesses the investigators had encountered, which surprised exactly no one who had seen her handwriting. Victor Langford resigned the week after the board meeting. His personal attorney issued a statement saying he was stepping down to focus on clearing his name. His name did not, over the following months, get particularly cleared. Gary Elston settled a civil suit in March without admitting liability, which was the kind of legal outcome that meant everything and nothing simultaneously. Lawrence Pratt and Susan Chung resigned from the Hayes Logistics Board in December. David Holt resigned in January and issued a public statement that was 3 paragraphs of carefully lawyered language that managed to convey, between its lines, that he had been naive and was sorry about it, which was not quite enough, but was something. Olivia rebuilt the executive team through the winter. It was slow, imperfect work. She hired wrong twice and had to course correct, which she did without excessive self-criticism, which was itself a change from how she'd operated before. She brought in a new CFO in February, a woman named Sandra Ortega, who had spent 15 years at a competitor and had the specific quality of not being impressed by the size of the company she was joining, which Olivia had decided was the quality she most needed. She restructured the board governance policies. She created an independent audit process that didn't route through the CFO's office. She had the company's bylaws revised to eliminate 3 procedural gaps that had made the whole thing possible in the first place. It was not glamorous work. Most of corporate governance was not glamorous work. It was the organizational equivalent of replacing fence posts, necessary, unglamorous, and invisible until the fence failed. She flew to Cedar Hollow 4 times between November and April. The first time was in December, 2 weeks after the board meeting, ostensibly to discuss a legitimate easement matter with her father's caretaker, but actually because the hotel rooms were getting to her, and Cedar Hollow had become the place where her nervous system believed it was allowed to stop performing. She brought Emma a book about geology she'd found in a Denver airport. Emma was going through a geology phase, apparently, sparked by a science class unit on mountain formation, and Emma received it with the intensity of a person who had been waiting for exactly that specific gift without knowing it. Mountains are basically just very slow collisions, Emma told her at dinner, with the authority of someone who had been reading for 3 hours. That's a good way to put it, Olivia said. My dad says everything interesting takes a long time. Olivia looked at Mason across the table. He was looking at his soup. Does he? He says patience is just stubbornness with better marketing. He said that to a 9-year-old. I'm almost 10. You're 8 months from 10. That's almost. Mason looked up. He had the expression of a man who was used to being discussed in his presence and had made his peace with it. She asked me what patience meant, he said. I gave her an honest answer. It's a very good answer, Olivia said. Tell him that, Emma said. He never thinks his answers are that good. Emma, Mason said. I'm just saying. The second visit was in January, when the Colorado mountains had 4 feet of snow, and the farm road was navigable only because Mason had a truck with the clearance and the experience for it. She helped him clear the barn roof of snow accumulation, which was not a skill she possessed and learned badly and slowly, to his visible amusement, though he never said anything about it directly. Emma built a snow structure in the yard that she described as an architectural experiment, and that looked, to Olivia, exactly like what a 9-year-old built when given unlimited snow and no constraints, ambitious, Irregular, impractical, entirely her own. The third visit was in February, and she brought her laptop and worked from the kitchen table for 3 days while Mason worked the farm and Emma was at school, and it was the most productive 3 days she'd had in months. There was something about the kitchen, the worn counters, the cast iron hooks, the paper turkey that Emma had replaced with a paper Valentine in early February, and then replaced again with a hand-drawn geological cross-section of the Rocky Mountains for a school project, that arranged her thoughts in a different order than hotel rooms did, a quieter order. She didn't examine this too carefully. The fourth visit was in April, when the snow was mostly gone and the orchard was doing something tentative and hopeful with its first buds, and Mason was putting in new fence posts along the north boundary, finally, 2 years after he'd been meaning to. She held posts while he drove them, which required standing still in the same spot for long stretches of time while he worked, and she was surprised to find she didn't mind it. She was usually bad at standing still. "I've been offered the board chair," she told him on the third post. "Permanent. Margaret Tan nominated me." He drove the post. "You're going to take it." "I haven't decided." He looked at her briefly. "You've decided." "I'm still deciding." "You've decided." She held the post. "Yes, fine. I've decided." She paused. "It means more time in Virginia." "I know." "And more She stopped. "I'm trying to figure out how to say this without making it sound like a problem I'm solving." He straightened, looked at her. "Say it however it comes out." "Cedar Hollow matters to me," she said. "The farm matters. Emma matters." She looked at him directly. "You matter. And I don't know how to. I'm good at structure and I'm bad at uncertainty, and this has a lot of uncertainty in it." He was quiet for a moment. "Every honest thing has uncertainty in it," he said. "The ones that don't are the ones that aren't real." That's very philosophical for someone who drives fence posts. "I've had time to think." She looked at the orchard, the pale new buds on the apple trees, the mountains at the edge of everything, still carrying snow at the top. "Do you want me to keep coming back?" she said. "I need you to tell me honestly, not considerately, honestly." He looked at her for a long moment, the kind of look that wasn't performing anything, not warmth, not caution, not the specific restraint she'd noticed in him from the beginning and had gradually understood was not distance but care. The care of someone who had learned that the things he said out loud tended to become real, and who had spent 4 years being very deliberate about what he allowed to become real. "Yes," he said, "I want you to keep coming back." She breathed in, out. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he said. He went back to the fence post. She held it steady. They didn't talk about what it meant in detail, that day or for a while after. Some things had to be built the way fence posts were built, one at a time, tested for stability before the next one went in. They were two people who understood structure. They understood that the structure had to be right before you could put weight on it. It was late May when Emma figured it out. Or rather, Emma had known for some time with the specific, unapologetic clarity the children had about the shape of the world around them, and late May was when she decided to say so out loud. They were on the porch, the three of them. Mason in the old chair he'd inherited with the house, and never replaced because replacing it felt like a commitment to a different version of the porch than the one that had always existed. Olivia on the step, her shoes off, her laptop closed for the first time in 2 days. Emma on the railing. Not supposed to be on the railing, she knew this and was on it anyway with the confidence of a person who had assessed the risk and decided it was acceptable. "You're going to keep coming back," Emma said to Olivia. "Not a question." Olivia looked at her. "Is that okay with you?" Emma considered it with the full gravity she applied to most things. "I think so," she said. "You're useful." "Thank you," Olivia said. "And you laugh at Dad's jokes." "His jokes are actually funny." "I know, but other people don't always get that." Emma swung her legs from the railing. "He makes a face when things are funny, a small one. You always catch it." Mason was looking at the orchard. His jaw was set. The face he made when something caught him off guard, and he was trying not to show it. "I notice things," Olivia said. "I know," Emma said. "That's why you're useful." They sat on the porch as the evening came down off the mountains, and the light went gold, and then amber, and then the particular soft dark of a Colorado night, which was not like the dark anywhere else Olivia had lived. More complete, more total, but not threatening. Just the dark of a place that didn't need to perform for anyone. The orchard was a set of shapes against the sky. Dolores had settled into her evening grievances and then quieted. The fence posts along the north boundary stood straight in the last of the light, new wood bright against the old posts around them. Mason looked at Emma on the railing and decided not to fight the battle tonight. She'd come down when she was ready. He looked at the orchard, at the mountains above it, at the farm that was his and Emma's and that he'd built his whole self around for 4 years, and at the woman sitting on the step with her shoes off and her laptop closed, who had walked up to a fence line in October with a manila folder and turned out to be one of the most honest and complicated and genuinely capable people he'd ever known, and who was looking at his orchard the way people looked at places they were starting to think of as theirs. He thought about Claire. He let himself do that, which he didn't always. He thought about what she'd said on the porch in March, 2 weeks before the ice on Route 145. You're going to be useful to people again someday. He hadn't understood then that useful wasn't the whole of what she meant. That what she meant was, you're going to let people in again, eventually. You're going to find that it's still possible. You're going to be surprised by the shape it takes, because the shape it takes is never the shape you're expecting. He'd have argued with her about it. If she'd said all of that out loud, he always argued with her. She was usually right. Emma, he said, railing. I'm being careful. Off the railing. Emma got off the railing with the expression of someone performing compliance under protest. She sat on the step beside Olivia instead, close enough that their shoulders were almost touching, and looked out at the orchard with the same contemplative expression she got when she was about to say something worth listening to. The Fujis came back, she said. Mason looked. She was right. The late apple trees he'd worried about in October, after the early frost, had come through the winter and were leafed out now, and looked against all the reasonable expectations of that first cold morning like they were planning to produce a decent crop. They did, he said. You were worried about them. I was. But they were fine. Apparently. Emma looked at him, then at Olivia, then back at the orchard. I think sometimes things seem like they're not going to make it, she said, and then they do anyway. The porch was quiet for a moment. That's very wise, Olivia said. I know, Emma said, without arrogance, just acknowledgement. Mason looked at the Fuji trees in the near dark and felt something loosen in him. Not dramatically, not all at once, but the way things loosened when you'd been holding them under pressure for a long time, and the pressure finally, gradually, became something you didn't need to carry anymore. Not gone, not forgotten, just not the thing that controlled the weight of every day. He'd spent 4 years being careful. He'd spent 4 years building a life that was exactly the size he could manage, exactly the shape that fit the version of himself that had survived what he'd survived. He wasn't sure that version was done. He wasn't sure you were ever done becoming who the hard things had made you. But there was a woman on his porch step with her shoes off, and his daughter was sitting beside her talking about apple trees, and the orchard was leafed out and green and improbably alive after a frost that should have taken it, and the fence posts along the north boundary were finally straight. Some things took a long time. Some things looked like they weren't going to make it, and then did anyway. Some things had to be built one post at a time, tested for stability, given the space to hold what they were eventually going to hold. He was not a man who said things before they were ready to be said. He was not a man who reached for the version of a moment that was bigger than the moment actually was. But he was also, underneath all of it, underneath the 4 years of careful and the careful before that and the particular kind of hurt that taught you to be careful, a man who knew how to recognize something real. And this was real, not perfect, not clean, not the version of this that got told simply, but real, which was the only kind that mattered and the only kind that lasted. The night came fully down. Emma started to tell a story about geology. Mason listened. Olivia listened. The mountains held the valley the way they always had. The farm sat inside that hold the way it always had. And on the porch of an old farmhouse in Cedar Hollow, Colorado, 3 people who had not planned for each other sat together in the dark, not going anywhere, which was its own kind of answer to a question none of them had known, until now that they were asking.